Hello and welcome to another episode of the Establish the Edge podcast. I'm your host, Mark Dankenbring, and we'll be joined today by the projections crew you know and love, Jack Miller and Ben Gretch. Jack and I are part of the NFL projections team here at Establish the Run, entering our fourth year together, doing this full time. Meanwhile, Gretch is our honored guest throughout this series, out here grinding through these episodes, despite being on two other podcasts you can now listen to, Stealing Bananas with Sean Siegel and The Long View with Jacob Sanderson. You can also find his written work at bengretch.substack.com. Today marks our last episode of this projection series. We'll be going through the NFC East, all four teams out there. But just off the top here, just wanted to express some gratitude, on being able to do this series this year. Truly can't express how awesome it was to do this. Big shout out and thanks to Gretch for taking the leap with us. When we were kind of introduced to him by Leone to potentially take over this summer, neither Jack or I had ever necessarily talked with Gretch or worked with him specifically. So Gretch, huge shout out to you. Really learned so much throughout the process and extremely grateful for the opportunity. And then Jack, you crushed it as well. It's been awesome to work with you and see you grow over the last few seasons. Really thought your insight came through in a meaningful way throughout this series and was invaluable. So pumped for another NFL season with you, Jack. But Gretch, it's our last show here. Should we go 3 hours to commemorate? How you feeling entering this last episode?
I mean, that would be my big takeaway from this year over some of the last years was the shows were longer, right? The amount of time we had, like scheduling's harder when you have three people. It's like little things like that you don't think about. With Leone, I mean, we're both sad dads. We would just find time on a Sunday night to hammer out two back to back or whatever. A little bit trickier. I think we did most of our recording over 3 week spans in the past, and I think ours with you guys this time was maybe more 4 or 5 week span, and again longer shows. So it's been a little bit of a labor of love, but I've really enjoyed working with you guys. It's had a different feel, but I mean I think it's been great. And I always say this every year with Leone. I mean it with you guys. I think you guys at ETR have the best projections in the industry, so it's such an honor for me to get the opportunity to test the stuff that I'm looking at against what you guys have, hear your guys' feedback. So it's just an incredible opportunity for me. Thank you for having me on again.
Of course, man. Yeah, certainly invaluable. Appreciate the respect and shout out there. Obviously, we have a full team at ETR helping us out with data science, and then obviously Jack and I and Leone on the player inputs. So truly impressive to see you do it all on your own there, Gretch. But Jack, we made it to this last episode without getting booted by ETR corporate. How you feeling today entering episode 8 here?
I'm feeling good. We're coming up on, I think this will put us over 20 total hours of recorded podcasts. So shout out to the listeners for putting up with 20 plus hours of us talking about, going through the wide receiver fives on every NFL team. You guys are real sickos. Shout out to Mark for filling in the host chair. That's not an easy role to fill. I think he's done a very good job at it. But I'm excited to talk about the final division, the NFC East today.
Yes, sir. Let's get into it. And we are going to start in Dallas with the Cowboys. A decent bit of continuity here for our first team. Brian Schottenheimer returns as head coach and play caller. They bring back George Pickens on the franchise tag as well. No massive news to talk about in terms of kind of players departing or coming in. They do lose Jalen Tolbert as their wide receiver 3 here. So runway a little clear for Ryan Flournoy. But let's talk through the team level inputs here for the Cowboys. At ETR, we're at 63.6 plays. Gretch is at 64.4. We're both at an even 61% pass rate here. So just kind of looking at the Cowboys over the years, they've been second in plays per game in 2025, fourth in 2024, and second in 2023. Has been consistently sustainably high for Dak Prescott in this offense over the season. So again, a lot of continuity here. Jack, what are your expectations?
Is this the top for you guys? It's the top for me.
In terms of plays per game? Yes.
Right.
Yeah, they are first for us in projected plays per game. I think a lot due to that consistency over the years with Dak at the helm here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Jack, take us through your team level thoughts here for Schottenheimer and the Cowboys entering year 2 under his reign.
Yeah, I think we mostly know what to expect here. Pat Thorman pointed out in his pace preview that the Cowboys have been top 8 in overtime adjusted plays per game every year since 2019. That's across a variety of play callers. I think Dak Prescott really keeps this a fast offense regardless of who's calling plays. And then with Schottenheimer, They've been between 11th and 18th in pass rate over expectations 3 straight years. Didn't really see a big departure last year with him taking the head coaching job. So I think that this, from a team level standpoint, is one of the easier teams to project. They're going to be fast. We know what to expect from a PROE standpoint, and I'm not really surprised to see us and Gretch both within a play, and then we actually have the exact same called pass rate at 61% here.
Yeah, the team level stuff, we really got dialed over the second half of this series. So some of the early ones, I think I mentioned this on another show, it was like, are we not going to be as dialed this year? But got a lot more dialed. It helps when you get Thorman's pace and snaps article. It started to influence my read on a lot of this stuff. He's obviously the GOAT at that. But as you guys said, I mean, it goes back, I think, even further, top 8, or maybe you mentioned this, but top 8 in plays for 7 straight years. I mean, it's been a Dak thing for a really long time. They had a slight negative PROE last year, but Week 18 was their run-heaviest game with the starters out, and they also had Lamb missing a little bit of time. And they also have the 29th toughest schedule this year, but like a solid win total. I'm expecting a pretty, them to be in competitive games, some shootouts. And this looks like a team you want to have exposure to in fantasy football.
For sure. On a macro level, we have Dallas projected for the 6th most touchdowns on the season for us. And then in terms of personnel usage, last year the Cowboys were 6th in the NFL with a 68% 11 personnel usage. And Schottenheimer was asked if he wanted to get into more 13 personnel usage this season. His response was no. I think we're always going to try to play our best players. We think there's a lot to getting our weapons and speed on the field. So this is something we kind of hit on earlier in this series, is not every team is going to lead into the heavier personnel, and Shoddy kind of rebutting that potential for the Cowboys this year, obviously with CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens leading the wide receiver room, and then again Flournoy probably stepping into that wide receiver 3 role this season. But let's go into the Dak projections again. Since we're similar on a team level here, we're also similar on Dak and have a good sample size on him. Probably the biggest difference, we're at 7.6 yards per attempt. Gretch is at 7.8. We've consistently come in a little bit lower, again, on just kind of the quarterback efficiency here. But we both have Dak completing 66.5% of his passes, or even a little bit higher. Gretch is about 300 yards clear of us in the total passing yards department, and then has 32 touchdown passes. We're at 30 there. So I think Jack, for Dak Prescott here, my big note was, since he fractured his ankle in 2020, the rushing contributions have really fallen off from a fantasy standpoint. He's only averaged 160 rush yards over the last 5 seasons. Meanwhile, in his first 4 seasons in the NFL, he was averaging over 300 rush yards per season. Also had 21 rush touchdowns in his first 4 years. He's only had 7 rushing touchdowns in his last 5. So we are expecting almost all of his fantasy production to come through the air. How are you viewing this outlook for Dak Prescott in 2026?
Yeah, I think you're getting from Dak. He doesn't get designed run to scramble, where he was down to 3.3% last year. So like you said, you're not getting a lot of rushing contribution. But the Cowboys are projected for the 6th most, or they're implied, I should say, for the 6th most points per game. We know they're going to score a lot of points. We know they're going to play really fast. We know Dak has really good weapons, especially a wide receiver. And he's been efficient as well. So I think that Dak is a fine fantasy quarterback. He might not have like the true elite ceiling given the lack of rushing, but the passing efficiency here does have the potential to be really good. And we know that they're going to run a lot of plays and throw a lot of passes. So I think that Dak is kind of like the team level, more of a straightforward projection.
In terms of quarterback points per game, Dak has finished as high as QB4 in 2023 and as low as QB20 in 2024. So a bit of a gap there. Gretch, do you have much concern over Dak entering this season?
No, I'm actually really optimistic. I think he continues to put, this is more of like a film thing from, writing signals every week and everything. But I think he continues to put together really great years through the middle of his career right now. That I think he's always a bit underappreciated, honestly. I do think he's just getting better over time, like some of these pocket passers do. You mentioned less running. Last year, his sack rate also fell a little bit as his dropbacks were really high. And one of the things that I think it's, the emphasis here is similar to some of the other guys that we talk about with the efficiency on volume at quarterback, the putting everything on his shoulders and throwing into difficult pass coverages. It's not easy to be this efficient on the volume he's doing it at. He was one of only 2 passers over 600 attempts last year. He led the league in completions. He was one of only 3 passers over 4,500 yards and 4 guys over 30 pass TDs. Comp percentage was up slightly. Pass TD rate was solid. Interception rate was a career low. Yards per attempt strong. This guy continues to just get better and better. Obviously, the George Pickens breakout helps that along a little bit. Lamb missed a little bit of time. We'll get into him, and I would expect, or hopefully, you'd get a healthier season out of Lamb. You talked about Flournoy as the new wide receiver 3. I think this is the best trio of receivers that they've had in a really long time. Basically, since Amari Cooper left and you had young CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup. But, I mean, there's an argument Flournoy is like better than Gallup. Prime CeeDee Lamb's going to be better than young CeeDee Lamb. I think Pickens is probably better than Cooper was at that time. I mean, this might be the best trio of wide receivers. That's part of why the efficiency is high. You mentioned on the yards per attempt. I'm seeing this as like, I always project the more optimistic stuff. If these guys are healthy, I have more of the volume going to the wide receivers as a whole, taking away a little bit from like a Jake Ferguson, which is, I mean, Ferguson's fine, but it's going to be lower yards per attempt on those types of throws. And so I'm actually like pretty optimistic about how good of a passing season Dak could have, even with the lack of rushing. And to Jack's point, you know what you're getting, but I do think there's like incremental improvement, and it may even be that much better.
Yeah, I like it for sure. Let's go to the backfield here. Javonte Williams was one of fantasy's, I think, bigger breakouts last year. Certainly, helped people win a lot of leagues as he was going in the double-digit rounds, and then came out as the Cowboys, day one starter and held that role throughout the season. So inputs wise on Javonte for this season at ETR, we're at 214 rush attempts. Gretch is at 220. We're at 36.5 targets. Gretch is at 45 here. In terms of the backup role, we have it split between Jaden Blue and Phil Maffa, Malik Davis, those 3. We actually tilted it a little bit towards Jaden Blue recently, as he's the youngest of this backfield, as well as has kind of gotten more of the offseason coach speak here, has Blue and does profile to potentially take some pass catching work away. That's kind of where I want to start with Javonte Williams, because he had a horrible receiving output last year, only a 0.44 yards per route run and 2.7 yards per target, according to our SIS data. Just absolutely brutal, production there. And JJ Zacharyson has done some research on lower, yards per route run metrics for running backs, leading to decreased target volume in the following season. So with Jaden Blue kind of getting some hype, I'm a little bit worried that the receiving role for Javonte will be reduced this season. But in terms of the goal line role, I don't think there's any question there necessarily. So Jack, how are you viewing Javonte Williams? Again, going much higher in drafts this year, kind of the end of the 3rd round, but we've been head of ADP on him so far this year. How are you viewing Javonte going into his 2nd season as the Cowboys starting back?
Yeah, I think he should be the clear workhorse from a rushing perspective, at least. Through the first 14 weeks of the year, he had only 2 games under a 69% design carry share. That's really good. He had a neck injury in week 15, and then he only outcarried Malik Davis 37 to 36 from weeks 15 to 17. Jerry Jones called it a top priority to re-sign Javonte, and they did that before free agency started. I do think that the receiving workload is a little bit in question with how much the Cowboys have been talking up Blue all offseason. Blue had 42 catches in his final season of college. The Cowboys in general haven't been throwing to running backs that much over the past couple of years. The last 2 years, 13.5% running back target share and 13.9% running back target share. And now, like Gretch said, this is potentially the best wide receiver trio that Dak Prescott has ever had, which could push even more targets toward wide receivers and away from running backs. And given Javonte's receiving inefficiency last year, 2.7 yards per target, according to our numbers, that could go away if they trust Blue. It'll be interesting. They've been talking up Blue all offseason. Schottenheimer said that Blue brought a great work ethic to OTAs and will be a huge part of what we want to do. All the reporting seems to be that they want him to be the complementary back to Javonte Williams, and it's kind of up to him to actually seize that opportunity. Last year, it didn't really seem like they ever trusted him. Maybe some maturity type issues for Jaden Blue. So going into year 2, ideally that's fixed, I think, in the Cowboys' eyes. I think it is a little bit interesting to think through what happens if Javonte goes down. Blue only had 134 carries in his final season at Texas. He weighed in at 196 pounds at the NFL Combine. They do have Phil Maffa, who they drafted in the 7th round last year. He missed most of last year with an injury, but he did have 561 career carries at Clemson. the thing is that last year in week 18, Blue out carried Maffa 16-5. So you did see them lean into Blue with the rushing workload without DeVonta. So I think that that's a good sign in Blue's favor. But I still think it's at least worth thinking through what the split looks like if DeVonta misses time between Blue and Moffitt. They still have Malik Davis. Maybe he figures in. But I think that they want Blue to take a step forward, particularly in the receiving game, since DeVonta struggled so much there last year. And I think that as we get into camp, which starts next week for Cowboys veterans, we'll kind of see whether that's going to materialize and whether the concerns that plagued him as a rookie have kind of gone away as the Cowboys hope they will.
Now, there's a lot of great stuff there that I want to hit on. As far as Blue, I've had a hard time with him. I was really into him last year. I've had a hard time with him from a couple perspectives, but I do completely agree that they seem to really want him to take that role and go with it. And it is kind of how they do things. Like they did that with Rico Dowdle a few years ago. They kind of just like decide who they want to take these like roles, and then they make them available. Did it with Jalen Tolbert a couple years ago, and he was just not a good enough number 2 wide receiver. Blue, one of the issues with the breakout profile for him is Hunter Lepke, who they like definitely still like. There were some early offseason quotes that were, I mean, just weird. There's just like, we want to find, like Brian Schottenheimer early in the offseason was like, we want to find more ways to use Hunter Lepke, which like I don't believe, but also doesn't suggest that they see the stuff that they were doing with him as stuff that they want to get rid of. And I think there was something about like their exit interviews. He came in and he was like talking about he thought he could help the team more. And Brian Schottenheimer in the media was like, and I agree with him. And I was like, why do you agree with him? What is that? But they used him a lot in a third down and long down and distance role. If he's getting that like segment of the target volume, Javonte's still going to get some as the lead back. Then how does Blue's receiving role actually materialize into enough volume is sort of the way that I'm concerned about that. And then you talk about the handcuff element of it, which is like, does he get enough of the rushing, which Jack laid out? And so there's this question for Blue for me on both sides of it. And then there's also a question of like, is he just good? Like, is he good enough? Because he struggled last year. It does sound like that was all maturity stuff, and they're saying all the right stuff there. But when you have the Lepke thing and then you have the contingent value concerns, they do have Malik Davis and Phil Maffa as well. I don't really know how that's going to shake out. It feels like it's got to be 2 of those 3 because they're going to have Lepke active as well. And so it's not really clear to me who has the lead. You guys have a lot more for Maffa than me. I've kind of been thinking that Maffa would be left out because with Malik Davis, I mean, he actually was getting work later in the year. Javonte had whatever his health thing was. He had like a neck and shoulder issue that caused him to miss some time in the last, like, I think it was 2 of the last 3 games he left early, and Malik Davis stepped into that RB2 role. So 15, 16, 17, he hurt himself in 15. He played through it for a few weeks. Davis actually outsnapped him in that 3-game span, and he got 20 carries in week 17 and posted the team's first 100-yard rushing day since Javonte in week 7. That's Malik Davis. Week 18, you mentioned that they had both Blue and Maffa active. I mean, I think they did this because they wanted to get the young guys work, but they made Davis inactive along with Javonte. It was sort of like, Davis is part of our first team. We're going to deactivate him and play the rookies and give Jayden Blue room to make a lot of, because it's almost like if we have Davis active, we have to use him ahead of Jayden Blue is like one of the ways to parse that. I mean, again, very tough to parse. Malik Davis is not like anything special, but he looked solid for a stretch. He had a nice run, I believe, on Thanksgiving as well, like a long touchdown run. And so down the stretch, he was starting to actually earn some real work. I think the convenient thing is to be like, Malik Davis is not going to be involved, and it's going to be Javonte, Jayden Blue, Phil Maffa. The maybe inconvenient truth would be that Malik Davis might actually be the number 2, right, for rushing work. And if Javonte Williams is out, he may be the guy that ends up getting the volume. He's not a huge back or anything, though. So I mean, Maffa does have size. I never really liked the Maffa profile. He's a big dude, but also doesn't seem to have a ton of explosion. It's more just 3 yards on a cloud of dust to me from what I'm seeing in the numbers. Doesn't even have like a ton of yards after contact. One of the things I mentioned last year was that Blue actually had more yards after contact per attempt as this small scat back than Maffa did as this big physical back. It's kind of not what you'd expect out of a bigger back like Maffa, but he didn't test real well. He's not particularly explosive. He reminds me of just like big backs that like AJ Dillon kind of turned into this. Like, he had a better athletic profile coming out, but he kind of turned into this, like, I'm just big and I just get you 3 yards. Anyway, I'm concerned about the blue thing. I want to be in on it. 4.2 speed. Like, you have a very exciting profile in a great offense. And that gets back to the Javonte thing for me as well. Part of the reason I want to be in on blue is I agree with you guys. I want to be out on Javonte. I had the same note about the yards per out run and the great work that JJ did, I think, starting last year. One of the specific things about that work was for dead zone type running backs. And it's not just necessarily they get less receiving, I don't think. I think it's that, like, they're just bad picks. Like in fantasy, like their actual production ends up being worse the next year. When you see that poor of receiving efficiency with Javonte, that is a pretty big concern for me. Another low-key concerning number is he had a 13.4% targets per route. That was a career low by more than 6 percentage points. He always had a really great 3-down profile in Denver and got volume in that Sean Payton offense on a per-route basis. There was pretty clearly, like, not intent, like, he's out there a lot and he's running routes, but not intent to throw to him in the past game. And then when they did, he was terrible. So you kind of understand that side of it. Like, the yards per target was really, really poor, as you mentioned. And then as far as the rushing, he was good last year. Clear bounce back. And I should say, before I say all this on Javonte, I was really in on him in his last year in Denver when he was terrible, and I was out on him last year, so I know nothing about Javonte Williams. But in terms of his rebound, missed tackles forced per touch pre-injury, 2021 as a rookie, 0.289. 2022, up until that injury, was at 0.333. That was the, year 2 breakout season that I was hoping for. That's what was in the profile out of North Carolina, was that this guy's an evasive monster. Post-injury, starting in 2023 and 2024, it's like half of that, 0.148 and 0.155. That's part of why I was out. I was like, even 2 years removed from the injury, he's still at 0.155. He's nowhere near where he was in the evasion rate. All of this is getting back to how much did he improve in 2025? 0.213. He came back up from that 0.15 range to the 0.21 to the low 0.2s, but he was not up around like 0.3 like he was pre-injury as a rookie and what he was as a prospect, because he had great evasion down in college. As far as like the long view stuff, did he come all the way back? Is he completely removed from the knee injury? I don't know that he is. They did give him the new contract. I completely agree with Jack. They're going to make him the workhorse. He's going to get a ton of volume. My projection on him is a lot of work. I do think he's a clear dead zone back this year. Like, he's a very fragile profile from he's going to get a lot of work, and he's going to get the goal line work, and you're going to probably get that small hit. It depends on how you, I guess, discuss the dead zone. Jack, you've written about the dead zone over the years more in best ball. The small hit, like, volume can work in best ball a little bit more. When I think about it from redraft, that's when I say clear dead zone. Like, I want to avoid this type of profile because I want the running back to have this huge ceiling, and that's kind of the way that I approach it, the dead zone research. And anyway, I think he's like a small hit and maybe a big miss with that, that big red flag on the receiving side. Although I don't know that there's a backup that would like take the work if he's healthy. It seems like it would have to be more injury related. It's a very complicated. Javonte is the clear one. How the backups, settle, and then what Javonte's profile actually is. I just wanted to emphasize. I think it's really interesting. I'm projecting him for solid rushing efficiency for sure this year because he looked good and he played well. He did have some long runs early in the year, and it did kind of fade a little bit as things went. So he's just one that I'm a little bit wary of. I don't know that he was back to what the promise of young Javonte Williams was.
Brandon Thorne did come in at number 9 overall in the Cowboys offensive line rankings, which I thought was a good sign for Javonte as well. Again, since we expect most of his work to be done on the ground. Last season, he was at 4.8 yards per carry. He's at 4.2 in his career. We're projecting 4.3. Gretch a little bit higher at 4.4 there, but certainly, projecting a little bit regression in the yards per carry department, and I think a little bit, pessimistic on the target volume, just in terms of Jayden Blue potentially earning the RB2 role over Malik Davis. Jayden Blue is 24 years old and Malik Davis is 28. Don't want to necessarily just like simplify it down to that analysis, but I do think the Cowboys obviously view Jayden Blue more as like the long-term option as the RB2, even if, Javonte went down like Malik Davis, I do think probably would mix in for carries as well as Maffa has a shot there as well. And yeah, the Hunter Luepke point is important to note, just given that they do trust him a lot in pass protection and did use him a lot on third down in that role, which I do think is another roadblock to Jayden Blue getting more of those pass down snaps. Just hasn't proven it at the NFL level that he can pass protect, and we know that the Cowboys trust Luepke in that role. Okay, let's go to this pass catching room. We mentioned that this is one of the most exciting wide receiver rooms to talk about in the NFL. CeeDee Lamb up top, George Pickens as wide receiver 2, and then Ryan Flournoy, who really capitalized on the time when Lamb was out last season. He figures to slot into the wide receiver 3 role. They also have Kamonte Turpin, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling remains alive here in this wide receiver room. So in terms of inputs here on CeeDee Lamb, we're at 140 targets. Gretch is at 152. On George Pickens, we're at 118 targets. Gretch is at 129. And then on Flournoy, we're at 50.5 targets. Gretch a little bit higher than us at 64. So pretty much identical gap between Lamb and Pickens. We're about 11 targets behind Gretch there, but we are 13.5 targets behind on Flournoy. So Jack, want to toss it your way first. Curious your vibe on this Dallas wide receiver room. Do you think CeeDee Lamb, he's going at the end of the first? Do you think he deserves that with the George Pickens breakout? And then George Pickens going at the 2-3 turn. So we have 2 pass catchers here going in like the first 2 rounds for a team. How do you see it breaking down for the Cowboys this year?
I think CeeDee's a fine pick. He was still clearly ahead of Pickens from a targets per route run perspective. He was at 27% last year. Pickens was at 23%. That number dropped to 22% for Pickens when CeeDee was on the field. It was a little bit of a decrease from CeeDee's peak in terms of target per route run. He was at 30% target per route run in both 2023 and 2024. We saw that drop to 27% last year. He was still at 9.2 yards per target. That was very, very efficient, despite having some really bad drops that cost him a lot of yards. They cost the Cowboys in some high leverage moments. Still at 2.44 yards per out run. I think that he's still clearly the wide receiver 1 here. I don't have much problem with him at the end of the first round. Pickens, 23% target per out run, more efficient than Lamb per target at 10.4 yards per target. They actually have the same yards per out run per our numbers, with Pickens getting fewer targets per route but more yards per target. And then we saw the ceiling for Pickens if Lamb ever misses time. In 3 games without Lamb, he had 28%, 14%, and 32% target shares in those 3 games. He had 4 touchdowns in those 3 games and 359 total receiving yards. He had 1 quiet game during that stretch, but 2 just completely monster games where he was at like 150-ish yards or so. And then Flournoy was really interesting last year. Mark, you tweeted yesterday, he only had a 30% route rate with both CeeDee and Pickens on the field last year, and they still have Kamonte Turpin, who ran 38% of routes for them last year. It did drop to 21% over the last 4 games, maybe as the Cowboys started to see what they had a little more in Flournoy. I think that the routes question is fair. I don't think Turpin is going to suddenly drop to like not playing and it's going to be Flournoy all the time. But I think Flournoy is probably pretty good, and he has 2-pronged upside. With if either CeeDee or Pickens miss time, he's going to step into a pretty full-time role. He had a 22% target per out run for the season, 8.5 yards per target, 1.83 yards per out run. Those are all really good numbers. He was a day 3 pick coming out of a small school, so it kind of makes sense that it took him a little while to get going, and he spent a lot of time in school, which I think maybe is a little more defensible considering he did come from a small school and took some time to get discovered. But I think Flournoy is really interesting as a contingent upside play. I know that we talk about that a lot more at running back, and a lot of the times it's not really applicable at wide receiver. But I think that this is probably an example where it is. Flournoy had 2 100-yard games last year. We've seen what he can do in a bigger role. It's just that with Lamb and Pickens kind of blocking his path to a full-time role, the normal role with him as the wide receiver 3 likely isn't that interesting. But if one of those guys goes down, I think that he could be a legit fantasy starter.
Yeah, I think he'd have to legit flip Jake Ferguson kind of in the target pecking order, which could potentially happen. I mean, Ferguson's targets have been quite inefficient over the years. But I do think it was noteworthy that with CeeDee Lamb off the field last season, Flournoy had a 30% target per out run, and Pickens was only at 26%. Pickens was out on the field, quite a bit more, but Flournoy really did dominate those opportunities. But with Pickens and Lamb on the field, it was only a 13% target per out run. So you definitely need that to come up if he's going to have any base value as a wide receiver. And Gretch, before I let you chime in here on the Lamb and Pickens thing, I would say my only concern over CeeDee Lamb is if the touchdown upside is going to be there. We saw that dip last year. He had only 3 touchdowns, which was easily a career low. The yardage and targets, across the season were really strong, but he was 3rd on the team in in terms of red zone targets with Pickens and Jake Ferguson ahead of him. So, when we're talking about first round wide receivers, obviously we want the profile to be like pretty impeccable. And I'm a little bit worried, just given Pickens and Ferguson's, renewal here in the offense, that CeeDee Lamb might be third in terms of touchdown pecking order. Gretch, I'm curious if you have any insight there. In terms of our projections, you're 0.6 touchdowns ahead of us on both Lamb and Pickens. So we're like in lockstep on the TD rate for those two. But I would say that's probably my biggest concern on Lamb, not necessarily the target earning by any means.
Lamb is Lamb's TDs are the one thing that I like. In my note, I wrote that I'm not really buying Lamb's low TD rates the past 2 years unless there's a good reason for it I'm missing. And I was going to actually ask you guys about it. I had it as like a question. I don't have like a lot of insight on it. I'm basically just saying I'm not buying it because he had higher TD rates earlier in his career. The big thing about the last 2 years with Lamb is he's played hurt a ton over the last 2 seasons. And he's one of these guys, when you look through his per game log as well, if you look at his numbers on a per game basis, you're going to miss some stuff because he only played 7 snaps in week 3 last year. He only played about half of week 14 due to a concussion. It wound up being one of his best games of the year. He was on his way to a 200-yard game against the Lions, got a concussion, and he only played half of week 18 as well. So you get this other element, which wasn't even health-related. Obviously, injuries are a problem, but one of the things I did really like about Lamb's 2025 is he played hurt. He played through a lot of that stuff. I like the dudes that play through stuff, and they aren't meaningfully worse. Like, Lamb was still able to put up good enough numbers that were like, is he declining? Like, no, he was hurt the whole year and still producing like 80% of what he is. I think CeeDee Lamb is elite. Like, I think he's still at the very, very top of all of it. I think he's better than George Pickens. I think he was better than George Pickens as a prospect. He's only ever backed that up. He's always been very good in terms of yards per target. He's always been very good in terms of targets per out run and both sides of the yards per out run profile. It's gotten better and better. The last couple of years been a little bit worse, and we finally see a peak Pickens seasons. And Pickens had intriguing stuff in his prospect profile and in his early career in Pittsburgh. He was one of my biggest stands last year. I was very in on him. It was awesome to see what he did last year. But now he's going with the 2-3 turn, and I do think you have to think, like, for example, in the 3 games Lamb's missed, Pickens' PPR scoring per game rose to 26.3 from a still solid but very more normal 15.2 in the other 14 games. You don't want to necessarily overweight the specifics of any splits. Like, he still had production. He was new in the offense and had to progress his way a little bit in the first 6 or 7 weeks, and then clearly established and was very good the rest of the way. I do think Pickens 2025 is like, this guy's incredibly good. It's also like a reminder that, like, how splash games can elevate a profile, which he tended to have when Lamb was out more. He finished wide receiver 5 in points per game among all wide receivers who played at least 10 games. But he was also still a back-end top 10 wide receiver, even if we just look at the games when Lamb did play. So it's not like he was bad when Lamb was on the field. He was just even better in that 3-game sample when Lamb was out. And that ability to raise your game and dominate a void created by a star being out is very, very positive, obviously. So I'm pretty into Pickens still. I do think the price rising is pretty meaningful. And then again, as it relates to Lamb, I do think, like, I've seen people talk about Pickens as being better than Lamb, and I think that's a little bit based on last year. And my thing is, like, this longer view. I think Lamb's body of work is better. And you go all the way back to the prospect profile. You go to a lot of the other stuff. Although, like, Pickens is a demon. Like, he's super good with the ball in his hand too, just like Lamb has always been. He's always been very efficient because he's a high ADOT player. But broadly, I also think it's kind of not the right way to look at wide receivers when they play alongside each other. I mean, there is that competition, and there is, like, Pickens' production with Lamb off the field going nuclear is a positive. But if Pickens was off the field, I would expect Lamb's targets per out run to jump right back up around 30%. So it works both directions. And again, I think, as I was saying, Lamb being banged up the last couple of years is sort of hiding how good he was. That game he left due to a concussion, he played 46% of the snaps. It was his highest yardage game of the year. I mentioned 121 yards, was well on his way to a 200-yard day, like I said. He was down from his peak with a 2.37 yards per route run, but that still eclipsed Pickens' career high, 2.35, in his breakout year last year. I mean, you're talking about some important contextual stuff when you really focus on this stuff. The touchdowns, as you noted, is a key part of it. And then as far as the Flournoy thing, I just wanted to say, impressive per out profile. I really liked your notes about when he was getting targets with those guys on and off. I love your guys' on-off data that you have. I had in my thing that his targets per out run was good at 19.4%. Again, PFF's data for not being a primary read on a lot of concepts. And as you talked about, he's going to be the primary read more when those guys are off the field. And that's when he did have a lot more. So that's really nice to hear. Strong yards per target efficiency. I will note on him, he's 27 in October, a bit older for a year 3 guy, still probably in his prime. The college career was legitimately intriguing across some smaller schools. People who listen to this religiously will remember I mentioned Flournoy pretty favorably in his rookie year as this guy that could maybe compete in that wide receiver 2 role because I liked the profile coming out. But I've always been a big fan of this guy. Reminds me a little bit of Jalen Coker in Carolina as like a UDFA that needed to work their way in, but always efficient, gaining more work, getting there. And then, as you guys were talking about kind of as a handcuff play, if either of those guys miss time, I mean, I think it opens up. Jack was saying he could be a legit player. I think he could be a legit player, but I kind of feel like in redraft, he's more of like a waiver wire play in season should that opportunity arise. Otherwise, he's kind of just like a handcuff on your bench. For sure.
I'm curious if Flournoy would get drafted much in traditional like home redraft leagues. I think he is clearly like if Pickens or Lamb went down, like spend a lot of fab on Flournoy. I'm a little skeptical that he's just going to completely overtake Kevontae Turpin. They've always had a role for Turpin in this offense, and he's been solid. He has a 1.70 yards per out run in his career, so has always been effective when utilized. That's Turpin once again there. So let's go to Jake Ferguson and the tight end room here on Ferguson. We're at 81.4 targets. Gretch is at 91. We both have quite low yards per targets here at 6.3 on Ferg, and that's where I wanted to start with him. Is he just has not been efficient at all, and really kind of relied on touchdowns to get there last year. But he's at a 5.9 and 5.7 yards per target the last 2 seasons. His ADOT is 4.4 over the last 2 years, so kind of just an underneath like release valve essentially for Dak Prescott in this offense. And so again, kind of carried on touchdowns last year. I'm a little bit skeptical of his profile with Flournoy emerging more as wide receiver 3 that potentially earn more targets. And then again, we just haven't seen much explosiveness from Ferguson at all. So if those end zone targets dry up, I think it could be a pretty empty season here for Ferg. So Jack, any interest on Jake Ferguson? We also have Luke Schoonmaker and Brevin Spann-Ford in this tight end room, who are mostly blockers. Schoonmaker more of kind of like the receiving handcuff if Ferguson were to miss any time.
Yeah, Ferguson does just keep getting volume, but the lack of efficiency is a little scary, especially now that they have 2 elite wide receivers and Flournoy potentially ascending 5.9 and 5.7 yards per target the last 2 years. He was still at a 17% target share last year. 16% target share last year. The targets per out run jumped from 19% to 22% with CD off the field, but he was still in the 16-17% target share range, even with CD on. You mentioned the red zone and the touchdown scoring. It's kind of difficult to know what to make of that. He had 3 targets inside the 10-yard line in 2024. That jumped to 13 last year. That was, I think, 4th in the entire NFL. So much of his profile comes down to, is he getting those targets inside the 10? I don't know why they would prioritize him so much inside the 10-yard line when they have Lamb and Pickens. So I think it kind of makes sense for that number to go back down, which would be a little scary for his profile given a potential Flournoy ascension and the lack of efficiency and kind of the volume reliance that he has. But I mean, he does just keep getting solid target numbers. So I think he's fine.
Yeah, he went from 0 touchdowns in 2024 to 8 touchdowns in 2025. So Gretch, curious your read on Ferg this season.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of TDs early in the year, and there were some Ferg victory laps out there. I've never been a big Ferguson fan. He's basically a routes dependent floor play to me at tight end. The touchdowns that started early in the year really just faded at that point. His targets per out run was down from 2024. His yards per out run was a career low. Kind of started with that bang, but really took a back seat as Pickens came on. And as I mentioned, Pickens was kind of finding his footing early. Pickens kind of really found his footing in the offense when Lamb got hurt at the first time. And it was like, okay. And from that point forward, it was like Ferguson he's just a guy, and he's kind of always been just a guy. My thing on the tight ends here, and goes back to Dalton Schultz, is that Dak really likes throwing to the tight ends when they go up tempo in the 2-minute and that stuff. These guys will catch like 4 balls in a row on a drive. And like in PPR, it's great. You'll get a bunch of work when they're even in just a 2-minute drill at the first half, late in the game when they get into these shootouts, up tempo stuff. you got the receivers pressing downfield, and if he can't hit them, he doesn't throw down to the running backs as much. He gets down to his tight end. It's just the way that Dak's always done it, and it was the profile for Schultz, and Ferguson stepped like running the same profile, routes dependent, floor play, but there are routes. He ran 498 routes. It was the 8th most of the position. I would guess he keeps the routes, but that's like what his profile is, and he sort of better keep them because there's nothing really else there.
Well,
I will add on Ferguson, potentially excusing some inefficiency. He did suffer a MCL sprain and a bone bruise in week 1. I think when it happened, it was expected to cost him more than 1 game, but it did end up only costing him 1 game. So maybe he was playing a little bit hurt too. He missed week 2. So just giving him that as a potentially an excuse, but generally, I'm mostly with you.
His metrics were quite strong with Pickens and Lamb on the field, though, last season. I will say with both those on the field, he was the clear 3rd target at a 16% target share, and like no one else on the Cowboys was above a 10% share. So that's kind of where the vulnerability comes in for me if Flournoy is able to kind of flip him as that 3rd target in the pecking order. But as Gretch alluded to, like Dak has always liked throwing the tight ends. The volume should be there. I don't think there's much threat to his role in terms of like routes. Like I don't think Luke Schoonmaker is coming for that, and it is Ferguson's fifth NFL season. He's 27 years old, so in his prime in that regard. So I don't think should be written off right away. There are some green flags there.
Even as a Ferguson hater, I don't think Flournoy flipping him is something I'm concerned about, just because of the way the offense functions, where he runs his routes, and what I was saying about kind of the underneath throws. When you have Pickens running vertical routes and Lamb runs his fair share as well, Ferguson's just operating in that short intermediate range where, I mean, I just like Flournoy's not going to run those routes even if he's out there in a 3 receiver set. I mean, he may run some. He's caught some underneath passes, but like that's where Ferguson's always going to be, and that's why he does do well when those guys are on the field because they're running off coverage. He's not good, but he's getting wide open because of that. I mean, he ran the 8th most routes, and I mean it's a floor play at tight end that you can make. I think it lacks upside.
Yep. All right, let's go to Philadelphia, where the Eagles are always in the headlines and an interesting fantasy team for us to target. Offensive coordinator has been like a turnstile for Philly the last few seasons, and yet again they have a new OC and play caller this year. That's going to be Sean Mannion. He comes over from Green Bay after being kind of a backup NFL quarterback for close to a decade. In terms of team level inputs on Philly, we're at 61.5 plays. Gretch is at 61.8. We're at a 56.7% pass rate. Gretch at 55% there. So both projecting, pretty modest play volume. Our 61.5 plays is 17th in the league, so kind of middle of the pack. The last 3 years, last year the Eagles were 20th in plays per game, 5th in 2024, and then 4th in 2023. That's just evaluating the real plays per game, which strips out kneel downs and I'm not sure what else, but probably spikes, I think. Yeah. So the real plays per game there. And then pass rate we have at 56.7%, which is 30th in the league. They've been 26th, 32nd, and 22nd in the last 3 seasons has Philly. So, this is a team we talked about, or this is similar to me with like the Bills. We had, way up higher in plays per game despite an elevated run rate. We're more middle of the pack here for the Eagles, but we did see them dominate in 2024 and 2023 at 5th and 4th in real plays per game. So I think that is on the table this season. But Jack, how do you see the Eagles offense operating under Sean Mannion in his first season here?
Yeah, the plays per game is a little interesting because, like you said, they were so high in 2023 and 2024 despite running so much. And with Mannion coming in and potentially installing a more competent offense, maybe I guess you could tell yourself they're going to get back to that. I think that I'm not expecting that because of Mannion coming over from Green Bay. An emphasis this offseason has been playing a lot under center, getting a lot of motion going, really getting back to the run game. I think that we've seen Green Bay be pretty slow over the years under LaFleur. I think that getting a similar system means that we're probably not likely to see like monster play volume games from this Eagles offense. There's also, unsurprisingly, been a big emphasis on getting the ground game back going. They obviously took a monster step back last year from where they were in 2024. They're installing wide zone offense. And their pass rate over expectation actually jumped last year too. They were at negative 9% in 2024. That was up to 18th in the league at negative 3.1% last year. So I think we get back to a run heavy offense here. Gretch is even lower than us on the run rate or the pass rate, which we've kind of talked about throughout the series being a trend given Gretch projecting perfect health and us not projecting perfect health. And maybe if Saquon goes down, the pass rate changes. But I think that we're going to see kind of a grinding offense, both in terms of pace and in terms of how often they're going to drop back.
One note that I thought Jack made on a previous episode that I think is prudent here to the Eagles is that for our player projections, we have a base case and a ceiling case for every player, but we can't necessarily do that on the team level, where I think like the Eagles do have a pretty high ceiling that maybe can't be captured the best in terms of like a base level team projection. Like I do think there is upside here for their plays per game to elevate back up to the top 5 like we saw in 2024 and in 2023 if that ground game can be as efficient as we saw in the first year with Saquon. And then we expect the Eagles to have a strong defense once again. So Gretch, I'm curious kind of how you view the Eagles as a team, again, with, you know, a new play caller at the helm. Scheme wise, how do you think Sean Mannion is going to change things up here from Kevin Patullo last season?
Yeah, I agree with that about the upside. I think so. I guess I'll start by last year. Like in my Stealing Signals weekly write-ups, I was mostly bashing the offense even after the 4-0 start, when a lot of people kind of were, but there was obviously then a lot of people pushing back, and there was media asking them, and Sirianni was basically like, what do you want? I mean, what do you expect? We're 4-0. Like, we're great and everything. And they were so extreme run heavy some weeks, and then they went really extreme pass heavy because they were getting, you know, kind of some pushback on that, and it didn't go as well, and they were bouncing back and forth in weird ways. They were very predictable, like run, pass, and those things. And I think they always take pride in still winning games in certain ways. Like they talked about that in 2024. They were a run-based team that were going to win. After their first loss, or maybe it was their second, I wrote, what happens when but we're 4-0 starts to fall off? What if they fall to 4-4? At what point do the questions become valid? Because, I mean, even when they were winning games, so, you know, I was questioning a lot of that stuff in the article, and then I was getting, you know, pushback. And I'm saying all that to say, not that I was right, but they still finished 11-6 and made the playoffs. Like, I don't think I was. But eventually their respected veteran lineman, Lane Johnson, who the year they went to the Super Bowl, I loved a quote that he had on Media Row where he was talking about how they self-scout and were aware of what defenses were going to try to do against them and constantly trying to find new things to implement before they needed to solve a problem. But it was like proactively iterating. The same way we've talked about with guys like Sean McVay and some of these other teams around the league. I love teams that do that stuff. Lane Johnson had an awesome quote about that from the media row from the Super Bowl season. After one of their losses, even when they had a winning record, he called them, quote, predictable, which like felt like vindication for me. And it was also coming from inside the building, right? Jeff Stoutland, their offensive line coach, ended up leaving, which was reportedly because of disagreement with Nick Sirianni. So there's been like some things that are changing there. But I'm saying that to say that their season last year went really bad, frankly, even though they went 11-6. I think that speaks to how high the floor is. This is the gold standard for team building. Howie Roseman is the gold standard. They have so much talent. They are so good at acquiring talent. When we go talk about their young pass catchers, I'm going to gush about the guys that they got. I think Mekhi Lemon is the best receiver in this class. Like I think they're so good at evaluating talent. I think Nick Sirianni's maybe a donkey, but whatever. We won't go there. As far as what Sean Mannion's going to bring, he's supposed to bring this under center Shanahan style. They have the 7th easiest schedule. I had in my notes like good team, should run plays. Obviously a big run lean. Part of the reason I'm so low is that expected pass rate based on the win total that I keep referencing. For them, it's really pretty low because their Vegas win total is 10.5 with a slight lean to the under from bettors, but it's a 0.589 expected pass rate. When I have them at 0.55, I got them just below a negative 4% PROE. That's sort of what I expect that they will be, and especially if they start to add plays, I think it's because they're running more, basically. I don't think it necessarily adds to the dropbacks. The way that I view it overall, I would say, is I view it like even a run-heavier version of Seattle's offense last year that went and won the Super Bowl. That blueprint, that run and play action, solidly negative PROE, and then Jalen Hurts sort of as the Sam Darnold, throwing on non-obvious pass downs when possible, off play action. Obviously, they'll use his mobility and he'll do some different things than Sam Darnold does, but I think Seattle did a really good job of putting Darnold in good passing situations when he did drop back. I think that'll be the goal with Jalen Hurts as well. So That's sort of the way I view it. They do still return all 5 starters on the line. One of the things they do incredibly well on the offensive line is they continue to draft and acquire new linemen every year. It's like an organizational philosophy, even when they're good. Coming off the Super Bowl, they used 3 day 3 picks to add depth in 2025. They used a 3rd and a 6th round pick on it again this year. And they also added like a free agent last year and maybe another one this year. They're not ever getting complacent with this part of their roster, but they did get Lane Johnson and Landon Dickerson back. They were both contemplating retirement. They do lose Stoutland as the O-line coach, which maybe is an underrated, element. I haven't had a chance to read Thorne's notes on them yet, but I saw that Thorne just posted. But it seems like the O-line is still a very, very strong team.
Yeah, and
unit.
With the Stoutland departure, I was very curious where Thorne would come in on the Eagles, and he's at number 2 on Philly right now. Okay. And he was taking questions for that. He's about to do a show with Silva and Levitan, talking through his full rankings. But I had a question for him, just on like how much losing Stoutland factored into his decision. He responded on Twitter to me, and he said, since their best 3 players are well-established top-tier guys and the expected system being run first, play action centered, quieted a lot of concern for me in this specific situation, although not totally / long-term. So I think still for the 2026 season, we can feel confident in this Eagles line with the continuity with Lane Johnson and Jordan Mailata as, 2 elite tackles bookending this line. And then, hopefully you get a healthier season just kind of from this group. But I certainly think that's going to be a question that's asked a lot, but Thorne has kind of quelled some concerns I had in that specific regard. All right, let's go to Jalen Hurts. Once again, returns as a starter here for Philly. In the last 5 seasons, he's been the QB7, QB6, QB2, QB1, and QB6 in points per game. And he's currently getting drafted as the QB7 this season. So it's potentially some decent upside for Jalen Hurts where he's going on underdog here. In terms of inputs, we're at 491 pass attempts. Gretch is at 499. In terms of rush attempts, we're at 118. Gretch is at 127. And then rushing touchdowns, we're at 9. Gretch is at 9.2. And that's kind of the point I wanted to hit on with Jalen Hurts is that last year, the rushing really did dip a lot. He only had 105 rush attempts for 421 rushing yards. In the previous 4 seasons with the Eagles, he had averaged 153 rush attempts and 695 rushing yards. So quite a big dip there. It's something we talked about with Lamar Jackson earlier in the Baltimore series. A lot of that came from the designed rush attempts per game. He did have a little bit fewer QB sneaks than the previous seasons, but not like a massive drop off there. But in terms of designed rush attempts, he only had 25 in 2025. That was 51 in 2024, 58 in 2023, and 68 in 2022. So pretty massive drop off there. So I think that's the big question to me is will Sean Mannion kind of return to the designed rushing game here for Jalen Hurts? But Jack, he's been one of fantasy's most valuable quarterbacks over the last handful of years. How are you expecting this year to go for Mr. Hurts?
Yeah, the rushing is the big question because, like you said, the design stuff is way down. 12.1% in 2024, 13.9% in 2023. That dropped to 7.1% last year. Jimmy Kempski, one of the better Eagles beat reporters, said that Hurts doesn't like getting a lot of designed runs. So I think that probably played into it a little bit. I think it's also clear that the Eagles offense is more dangerous when Hurts is running the ball. It probably sets up the rest of the ground game with Saquon a little bit better. So I think that's a big question is how much they get back to that. He also had a career low scramble rate last year down to 7%. There's been times just kind of watching him where he doesn't look all that fast. I don't know if I know a lot of the time he's been like fighting through injuries. I think it was 2024 when he was fighting through an injury over the back half of the season, which likely impacted his rushing game. But I think that's a big question. Another question, he had a career low 7.1 yards per attempt last year, and now he loses A.J. Brown, who averaged 9.7 yards per target throughout his Eagles tenure. He does get a big upgrade, in my opinion, in offensive coordinator, going from Kevin Patullo to Sean Mannion, and what you guys were talking about with more play action and kind of throwing when it's unexpected and potentially that increasing his efficiency from a passing standpoint. I think that makes sense. The rushing from a sneaks perspective, I think, is still going to be there. You mentioned it was down last year. That potentially could be attributed partially to just an overall downtick in how good the offense was, potentially generating less of those opportunities near the goal line and less of those sneak opportunities for Hurts. I think the rushing touchdowns are still going to be there. I think that the question, which I don't have a great answer to, is how much the designed stuff rebounds. I think that they'd be smart to bump it back up, but it sounds like it's something that Hurts himself isn't a huge fan of.
Gretch, it's a tricky projection in that regard because we haven't seen Sean Mannion necessarily with. Well, I guess he did have some starts with Malik Willis and utilized the design rush game, but I think that's more so like LaFleur than Sean Mannion in that regard. Do you have any take on Hurts's design rushing coming back, or is that not too much of a concern for you?
No, it's definitely a concern. I wasn't sure how to parse the sneak element of it because I know they struggled with the sneaks last year, which they've talked about, and I think they do want to get back to that. So I thought part of why it was down was just they sneaked less, but I was just kind of listening to you guys talk through it. I mean, as far as like the actual just rush attempts per game, I mean, I do the design and the scramble split out like you guys do, but also kind of just look at the zoomed out stuff sometimes. He was at least 8.8 rush attempts per game each of the previous 4 seasons as a starter and was way down at 6.6 this past year. I'm projecting him at 7.5 basically to just split that difference because I don't really know what I want to do. But when you look at like the actual fantasy output on the ground, you guys are mentioning how important it is. The last 4 years as a starter, because 2020 he started a little bit at the end, but obviously he wasn't a full-time guy in that rookie season. The other 4 years of his career, 600 plus rushing yards every year, double-digit rush TDs every year. He had 10 in that first season, but then 13 plus the next 3 years, 2022, 2023, 2024. And then 2025, he's down to 8 rushing TDs, and he's down to 421 rushing yards, basically 200 yards below his previous career low. It's a significant drop-off. It's a big reason when we did the AFC East, I mentioned Josh Allen ended up leading the league in rush yards, and there was no quarterback who had, or in quarterback rush yards, there's no quarterback who had 600 yards. Jalen Hurts would give you 600 yards every year like clockwork, but for whatever reason last year, well, the design runs, as you guys are talking about, that's the reason. Last year, he's way below it, and it's a significant change to his profile. Now, when I go and project him this year, he comes out really, really hot, and my note was... in part because I pushed him back to 7.5 rush attempts per game. And I think if you're thinking through that part of it, you're like, yeah, I mean, he has always been meaningfully more of a runner than he was last year. But the other part of it, my note was how the rushing TDs shake out is key. And if you look at it from the team level, they only had 17 last year. They had 29 the year prior when they won the Super Bowl. But even working backward on Hurts' first few years as the QB pre-Barkley, 22, 32, 25. We talked about with the Bills, they had back-to-back 30 rush TD seasons. I mean, this is a team that you would think would be right up there in rush TDs every year, and they are. But that's, I mean, multiple years over 25 is great. 1 year over 30. The previous low was 22 in a Jalen Hurts offense. Last year, 17 team rushing TDs. It's not just that his rushing TDs are down to 8. Barkley's were down to 7 as well. You wouldn't really expect that coming off of his 2024. And so then the question is like, what are you projecting for the team level? 17 feels light. I think they're gonna come back up in rushing TDs on the team level, but then how that works out, it was my big note. Like I ended up projecting more for him than Saquon, but I felt like I wanted to push more back to Saquon as well. And so there's this question and a projection of, and I only got him to 20.6, like shy of 21 rushing TDs, when prior to last year, it was 22 plus in all these Jalen Hurts iterations of the offense. So that side of it is tricky. I got him to about 21 rush TDs because I only have him at 24 pass TDs, and I have him above my market-based projected touchdown number, slightly above. And so anyway, I'm not like sure where those touchdowns would come from, but if this offense hits that ceiling that we were talking about, that it could, you would expect it to be right there, rushing touchdowns and a higher number there, and for Jalen Hurts to potentially get back to double digits, and potentially for Barkley as well. And that's really the thing for me that was the key, was the rush touchdowns in addition. But also on the passing, I do want to note, had a really bad year last year, right? This wasn't a very functional offense, but when his scrambles and sacks were both down last year, his completion percent was down, his yards per attempt was a career low. And then, yeah, in the design runs note, I just had that the tush-push success lagged, and that was my thought on that. But he is a guy who isn't going to throw to the running backs a ton. He's going to push it vertically more often, and I think as part of them getting under center and doing the stuff that all the teams getting under center are trying to do, which is marry the run and the pass and do more play action off of that. As he goes into that version of this offense, it'll be interesting to see if his pass efficiency comes back up a little bit. I have it rebounding a little, the yards per attempt bouncing back a little. But yeah, like I said, he's an interesting evaluation because this is a guy who has always had some real floor with the quarterback projection, and now he's going QB7 on Underdog, and he came out as my QB4. I'm coming out of that thinking, I mean, maybe am I too hot on the pass efficiency? This is one where there's a little bit of a gap. Maybe am I too hot on the rushing TDs? I'm very similar to you guys on the rushing TDs ultimately. I have about 100 more rush yards, but I have him at just 519. As I mentioned, 600 plus every other year before last season. They got a lot to prove this year. They got that easier schedule. I mean, I think Jalen Hurts might actually wind up being a pretty solid target at QB7.
Yeah, and we're at QB5 on him, so not too far behind you there. We looking into the rushing last night, I was like, man, we are pretty low on the rush yardage again. Just last year, was at 421 yards, easily a career low, and we're at 424 projection wise right now. So I think we might be low there. I'd honestly be willing to come up a little further on that, but to me, it comes down to kind of do the design rush attempts come back, and then in terms of a team level touchdown projection split, we have 22.3 rushing touchdowns projected between Hurts and then the 3 running backs. And we have Hurts projected to throw 23.3 touchdowns. So only a 1 touchdown gap there. So a little bit tighter than it sounds like you have, Gretch.
Interesting. That's good. Yeah. That's good feedback. I'm glad to hear that.
All right, let's go to the running back room. Saquon Barkley headlines this room once again this upcoming season. Tank Bigsby is in line to be the running back 2, and then Will Shipley remains the RB3 and kind of pass catching return specialist here for the Eagles. In terms of Saquon Barkley inputs, we're at 260 rush attempts. Gretch is at 263. We're at 47.5 targets. Gretch is at 47. On Tank Bigsby, we're at 101 rush attempts and 7 targets. Gretch is at 95 rush attempts and 6 targets. So almost in lockstep in this backfield, even trickling down to Will Shipley there. But on Saquon, if you include the playoffs, he's had over 825 touches the last 2 seasons, which I think is probably the biggest knock here for Barkley entering the upcoming season. And then when I was looking at his, touchdown scoring last year inside the 5, he had 9 carries and -3 yards on those carries. He only scored 1 touchdown inside the 5 last season. And looking back to 2024, he only had 4 touchdowns inside the 5 on 13 carries. So again, most of those touchdowns came from far out in 2024. So we're quite a bit ahead in terms of rushing TDs on Saquon. We're at 9.5 and Gretch is at 7.9 there. So I'm semi concerned on that as well. Again, just kind of given Hurts' success on the tush push around the goal line, that the Saquon touchdowns really came from far out, and he has not been successful close into the goal line. Again, maybe that goes back to the Lane Johnson, like, hey, we're too predictable on what we're calling, and they kept getting stuff to the goal line, and maybe that will flip this year with some better scheme. But Saquon has been the league's, I would say, probably biggest workhorse over the last 2 seasons. How are you viewing this 2026 outlook for him?
Yeah, the touchdowns is an interesting place to start because we are significantly higher than Gretch on his rushing touchdowns. And the way we do our rushing touchdowns is a little bit unintuitive. We have like a multiplier on our designed carry share, basically. And we're just at algo on both Saquon and Hurts. I think the lever for us to pull if we want to get Hurts up from a rushing touchdown perspective and Saquon down would be changing the number of Eagles touchdowns that we project to be sneaks. We're at 12.4% of Eagles touchdowns as sneaks right now. Our algo has 7.4%, but our algo is just like completely unequipped to handle a team like the Eagles that just tush pushes when they get within 1 yard. So I think that's one that maybe we could look at. We were higher on looking at our 2025 final projections. I think we were around 16%. So we're kind of middling our algo and where we were at the end of 2025. So potentially we could come up on the Eagles sneak touchdowns. But with Saquon specifically, I definitely think that the age and the workload is a concern. He's 29 years old. He has a significant workload history. As you mentioned, it should be a better team environment. I think with Sean Mannion coming over, the efficiency was way down last year, 5.8 yards per carry, which is obviously ridiculous in 2024 to 4.1 last year. The yards after contact per attempt was down a little bit from 2.0 to 1.6 according to Pro Football Reference, but the yards before contact was the bigger culprit, 3.8 yards before contact per attempt 2 years ago to 2.5 last year. The missed tackles forced per attempt per PFF was in line. So we were still evading tackles at the same rate via PFF, but the actual yards before contact was a big problem there. I think if the offense gets back to closer to where it was in 2024 with Mannion coming over, I think that that'll be good for Saquon. But you certainly can't dismiss a 29-year-old running back with his workload history. So it does make me a little bit nervous from that perspective, especially because we're only 3 carries behind Gretch on Saquon. Usually with these top-end guys, given the injury risk, we come in a little bit lower.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm about done. But I was just thinking between that and the touchdown stuff, maybe we could look back into Saquon. I do generally think, though, it makes sense to bet on a resurgence with the offense likely getting better. I think that if we get the Saquon we're used to seeing, because I don't think last year was really on him all that much. So I think that if we get the same caliber Saquon we're used to seeing in a better offense, I do like him at his ADP, but the age concerns and potentially us being low on the team touchdowns that are sneaks could maybe mean our rank is a little high at the moment.
It feels like I completely agree. It feels like a big if, right? Like it feels like a little bit of a concern. It feels like another one of these small hit, big miss profiles to me. I completely agree with everything you said. And then I was just, sorry to cut you off there, but I was going to chime in. That's exactly what stood out to me too, was that I actually am probably light on you guys, even though I have slightly more rush attempts, because when I went through it, I had all the same concerns that Jack just laid out. One of the main things was his breakaway rate was way lower in 2025 than 2024. And so, like, I wrote a piece last year about how yards after contact is really correlated to breakaway rate. I think people think about yards after contact like the Phil Maffa profile that I was just talking about, where it's just powering through. But, like, usually that's a couple of yards after contact. And then one of the things that actually happens with yards after contact, and especially when you start looking at it per attempt, like, a lot of the actual yards after contact come on the breakaway plays. Like, it's tough to get a untouched long touchdown run. Trayvon Henderson comes to mind, where he had really bad yards after contact numbers until his first long touchdown run last year, and he basically just got a hand to the thigh as he was running through the hole, and he got like 60 yards after contact and didn't get touched again. And it was like, this is just a speedster sprinting. He's not powering through anything. This is not what yards after contact is in our mind, but that's what happens with a lot of it. Anyway, his yards after contact fell, but I think a lot for Barkley comes down to his percent of rates. Or his rate of runs that were 15 plus yards, 7.3% in 2024, which is elite, 4.6% in 2025. He's had other years in his career. Go back to his rookie year, it was even higher than 7.3%. It was 7.7%, 6.7% in 2022. And it's bounced around because it's a breakaway run rate. There's been years even lower than 2025 in his career as well. And so you have this, question of like, how many explosive runs can I predict for Saquon Barkley? I don't know. He's a really old dude with not really old, but he's an older dude with with a lot of wear and tear on his tires the last 2 years, as you guys mentioned. There's been a lot of work for him. And then the part of that is interesting is that Tank Bigsby was the clear number 2 after he came over last year and ran very well. Jack mentioned that Saquon's yards per carry fell from the high 5s down to 4.1. I hate seeing that Bigsby in the same offense had 5.7 with strong evasion, strong yards after contact, and breakaway rate. I think Tank Bigsby's a high-end handcuff. Will Shipley has become kind of a core special teamser, and Bigsby has not. He doesn't really play on special teams. Shipley, I think, is a good player. He had a really good prospect profile. I think he might be a bit of the Kenneth Gainwell, like, offensive underuse thing because of also the receiving profile, which Hurts doesn't like to throw to the backs a whole lot because he's a more mobile and ball in hand, playmaking type quarterback where he's going to take sacks, he's going to scramble, those things. So anyway, Shipley's skill set doesn't really fit in that way, and then because of the special teams, I don't think he's getting as many carries. Bigsby, I think, is the clear number 2. I'm very excited about him, even though he doesn't have much of a receiving profile at all. On Barkley, I'm thinking about him similar, basically. Barkley in year 1 had a decent receiving profile. Really, the air yard stuff I talk about, he had a real ADOT. It completely vanished in 2025. We lost what little we had in the profile in terms of some explosive plays that came out of the receiving game. But in terms of just yardage, I think he's under 300 receiving yards both of the last 2 years in this offense. His targets per out way down than the rest of his career. He's a great receiving back. They don't throw to the backs a lot in this offense. So that's another part of it that I'm a little bit concerned about. I think it's an expensive bet for a rebound on rush efficiency. And especially when you think about the potential for Jalen Hurts to rebound. Like, I wound up with Hurts at slightly more rushing TDs. You guys do have Barkley for slightly more, but by half a touchdown. Like, Barkley's not going to, when you want the rush efficiency bet, like the Derrick Henry bet, you want 18 touchdowns in the range of outcomes. Barkley, you guys have for 9.5 rushing TDs, 1.2 receiving. I have him for a little bit less than that even. Maybe I'm low, but I don't love seeing that neither of us are projecting him for 15 touchdowns or anything like that on a pretty big workload as well. So this is a tough one. And just to wrap up the receiving thing too, in a more Shanahan-style offense, the under center stuff, the running backs don't always get a lot of targets unless a team makes it a priority, that they do with Christian McCaffrey in San Francisco now, and Mike McDaniel has done with his iterations of these offense. But like, Sean McVay's offenses typically don't throw to the backs a ton. Clint Kubiak's in Seattle didn't throw to the backs a ton because, again, a lot of the passing is off play action. It's off the running back faking a run. He's not necessarily like in a shotgun and like flaring out and some of those things, unless, like I said, Mike McDaniel's out here scheming stuff up for Devon Achane and making it a priority, or Kyle Shanahan scheming stuff up for Christian McCaffrey or what have you. I don't believe that what we saw, especially from year 1 to year 2 with Barkley, that the Eagles really want to or need to, because I do really like their new receiving weapons, actually. I think they're deeper in the receiving game than they were even with A.J. Brown last year. Use Barkley in that way with intent, and I don't think the targets per out run the last couple of years show a lot of intent in that side of things. So I do think you're betting on an older back where it's a pretty run-heavy profile, and I don't even know that we have huge touchdown potential. So that I always talk about the high value touches, the stuff in the goal line, plus the receiving. To me, Barkley is the guy that I always call him trap backs. Their trivial rush attempt percentage, our buddy Pat Kerrane came up with a few years back. It means that a lot of his work is carries that are not necessarily goal line carries, that are not necessarily receptions that add more fantasy scoring. Obviously, it's tough to fade Saquon Barkley anytime, but his price is pretty high for a profile, even in an offense that we talked about. I see a lot of ceiling, and I like Jack's last note there that he could clearly hit that ceiling. It just feels thin. It feels thin to me at his cost. And then as a result, if I'm not playing a lot of Barkley, I do just want to emphasize again, I love playing Tank Bigsby. His ADP is underrated.
I'll add on Bigsby. He's someone I think we all like at ETR internally, but it's hard for us to get to his ADP because so much of the Eagles design carries go to Saquon and Hurts. So it's just, even if we have Shipley for basically nothing, it's just difficult for us to actually get to Bigsby. We have him with a big ceiling. What we don't have him for is a lot of receiving work. I think that even if Saquon goes down, he's not likely to get that. And so that kind of hurts him from a base projection standpoint as well. I think if Saquon goes down, it's going to be Shipley handling the pass downs. But I do think, especially in redraft leagues, actually, I shouldn't even say that. I kind of think across formats, he's a fine pick despite our rank, because I think that he would dominate carries if Saquon went down in one of the better environments for a run-only running back to actually be fantasy viable. I think that a lot of the times if a guy goes down and a guy is only playing on 2 downs, it's not the most intriguing fantasy profile. I think given how much the Eagles run the ball, I think given how efficient we expect this run game to be, this would be one of the few spots where a 2-down back would be very viable. Bigsby out-carried Shipley 16-1 in Week 18 last year. He's reportedly had an awesome offseason. I think I've seen a couple of Eagles writers say that he's had the best offseason of any of their players on the entire team. So I think Bigsby clear RB2. It's hard for it's going to continue to be hard for us to actually get to his ADP because it's all contingent upside. Because I think that Saquon's going to dominate carries. I think Hurts is still going to get design carries. So there's just not enough carries in our base projection for us to get to Tank. And then when you throw in the fact that he's probably not going to contribute anything really, even if Saquon goes down from a passing standpoint, it's hard to get there. But I do like the actual bet, just kind of zooming out.
Totally agree. And to your point about this as being one of the main offenses where you can actually get a 2-down contingent up, profile with real upside. The other thing I wanted to say about Barkley that you talking about Tank reminded me is that offseason stuff and how much more efficient he was last year. Do I really think Tank Bigsby is going to cut into Barkley? No. It's part of why I think he's a small hit, big miss. You guys talking about how much work he's had over the last 2 years. He's older. This is a team with designs on long postseason runs. I don't think they're trying to get Barkley another 2,000 rushing yard season. I think they're trying to keep him healthy to win a Super Bowl. I think it's possible that Tank Bigsby actually does cut into that significant running back rush share that Barkley's had. That was something else when I was working through the projections. I was like, why wouldn't you give him a little bit of a breather when you have a backup that's been this good and this interchangeable? That would be devastating for Barkley's fantasy value.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because last year Tank Bigsby did not have more than 4 carries before the fourth quarter in any game that Saquon Barkley played in. You know, the two games were big blowouts in week 8 and week 15 that he was able to get 20 fourth quarter carries combined in those 2 games. And then week 18, obviously he had the RB1 workload there, but but again, we are projecting him to eat in quite a bit more. You know, we have 101 rush attempts for Tank this season just on as a base case. All right, let's go to the wide receiver room. Obviously, A.J. Brown, massive departure here for the Eagles. They do draft Mekhi Lemon in the first round. They also draft Eli Stowers in the second round. But DeVonta Smith profiles to be the clear wide receiver 1 in terms of routes and targets here for Philadelphia. He's had massive on and off splits with A.J. Brown off the field the last couple of seasons. DeVonta Smith has a 39% target per route run, and in 3 games without A.J. Brown the last season, he's had 9 targets for a 45% share, and then 10 targets for a 33% and 26% share. So you love DeVonta Smith this upcoming season, but you know you're paying up for him in drafts. He's going at wide receiver 12, ADP of 26 on Underdog right now. So in terms of our inputs, we are at 114 targets on DeVonta Smith. Gretch is at 112. On Mekhi Lemon, we're at 88 targets. Gretch is at 95. Then on Dontavian Wicks, who came over from the Packers, he is at 50 at ETR we're at 50 targets. Gretch is at 47. So a little bit higher on Wicks than Gretch. But in terms of like the split between Smith and Lemon, we're 8 targets behind on Smith and 7 targets behind on Lemon, which I was very eager to see because Mekhi Lemon has been the player, and at least on Underdog, we've been, I think, like furthest behind ADP on that has, I think, legitimate upside. And he's a guy that I like want to get higher on, but I struggle to see the path for us a little bit unless the plays per game really jumps up and we just get an overall, higher play volume from this team, because I don't think the pass rate for the Eagles has much of a ceiling as currently, constructed in this offense. So Jack, DeVonta Smith, amazing splits without A.J. Brown over the career, but they do draft, a first-round wide receiver and bring in Wicks and Hollywood Brown. So what's your outlook for DeVonta and the rest of this Eagles wide receiver room?
Yeah, they've been talking all offseason like he's going to be the clear wide receiver 1. I think that should be the expectation. DeVonta has a 39% targets per route run without A.J. Brown on the field over the last 2 seasons. The target share actually is only 23%, but I think a lot of that is because he hasn't been on the field either. I think a lot of those snaps are probably like blowout snaps where neither A.J. Brown or DeVonta are on the field. And like you said, the target shares in specific games without A.J. Brown, massive, 26%, 33%, 45%. He's reportedly put on weight, expecting wide receiver 1 workload. We do come in a little bit low on DeVonta versus market, which I think is more of a team environment type of thing. But I do think that he's the clear wide receiver 1. I think Lemon is kind of a more interesting conversation, though, because like you said, we've been so low versus market all offseason, which I don't think any of us feel good about, because I think we all like Lemon. I'm curious to hear where Gretch comes in, given that earlier he said Lemon was his favorite wide receiver in the entire draft class. But right now we're at an 18.5% target share projection. That is 1.5% ahead of Casey Concepcion, who was drafted in a similar range, 0.5% less than Carnell Tate, who was obviously drafted significantly higher. Lemon played most of his college snaps on the slot, but actually had a higher yards per out run on the outside. So I'm not too worried about him getting confined in a slot-only role. Maybe that's something we see in like week 1 with veteran deference, given they acquired Dontavian Wicks. But I think that it's probably eventually and pretty quickly going to be Mekhi Lemon as the clear wide receiver 2 here. But we're giving him that target share, which I think is pretty sizable and looks to be in line with where Gretch is. And we just come in way low. I just kind of on our back end messed around with his ceiling projection a little bit. We have him with an outsized ceiling compared to your average player, kind of in line with where we have your average first-round rookie wide receiver. We kind of naturally give those guys higher ceilings, but I just bumped his ceiling target share up 2%, which would kind of give him like the widest gap between base and ceiling projection of anyone. So basically testing what would happen if we gave him like the highest ceiling in the league, and we still come in 10 spots below his underdog ADP if we give him like the highest ceiling relative to his base projection in the league. So it's not really a knock on him as a player. It's just that given the fact that we have DeVonta Smith as the clear wide receiver one, and even with a fairly optimistic Lemon projection, which I think is completely deserving given the caliber of player that he is, we still come in just way low. So I'm not totally sure how to handle that, and kind of want to hear Gretch's take since he sounds really high on him as a player.
Well, I know I've talked about this in past years. I haven't talked about it as much this year. It's a projection show, but I mean, I think the Tank Bigsby and now Mekhi Lemon thing really drives it home that I guess I don't think you have to rank players exactly where the projections come out. I think this is a clear asymmetrical profile the other direction. It's a small miss, big hit profile. And I know like the way that you're doing the ceiling, you're really hammering it, but it's different than I just the way that I think about the way the asymmetrical stuff works with the small miss, big hit, small hit, big miss, and those things. I mean, it just it's hard to capture. Not everyone is a normal distribution curve, and it's really hard to capture everyone the same way in terms of what a base looks like, what a ceiling looks like. And so, I mean, I'm not even that much higher than you guys. I'm a Mekhi Lemon to that point. I mean, the one thing I'm seeing is yards per target. You guys are just over 8, between 8.0 and 8.1, and just below 8.05, basically. I'm at 8.5. I'll get into why I'm high on the ball in hand stuff and the ability to turn. I mean, he was over 10 all 3 years of his college career in yards per target, and there's reasons for that. He's one of these guys that does everything really, really well. That's why he's my favorite receiver in the class. To just jump to that part of it is he does, like you're talking about how he's better on the outside. He does everything you need to do. He wins short, he wins deep, he wins with the ball in his hand. He's very good on a catch right standpoint. He's undersized at 192 and he ran a 4.5 340, and there was some off like field stuff or like some of the interviews or whatever, I think during the draft process or whatever it was, people weren't thrilled about. But even though he's like not super athletic on paper, they used him as a kick returner, they used him as a runner. The explosiveness with the ball in hand is there if you watch him play. He's one of these guys that gets downhill and like turns cornerbacks around and is just eating up yards. Like I love guys that just get vertical. Like that's why it shows up in his stats. He doesn't dance around. He's not trying to make guys miss. He's running at you when he catches the ball, and that's why they use him as a kick returner. It's very clear if you just turn on a little bit of his tape. Howie Roseman on Lemon said there's a lot to like. Plays in the slot, outside, beats man, separation, physical player, good with ball in the hands. Good hands, good against zone, good instincts. I mean, I'm paraphrasing all that, but that's everything that you need as a wide receiver, just to sum that up. He mentioned everything, all the alignment, all of the ways that you can play, physical, good with the ball in the hands. Like I said, the production profile is elite. 3-year early declare, 3+ yards per out run, final 2 years. He was very limited in the first year. Huge targets per out each year, huge yards per target each year. The evasion is awesome. The yak per reception is awesome. That's why you get yards per target over 10 all 3 years, because you're doing it before the catch point and after the catch point. Even as a small sample freshman, yards per target was over 10. Targets per out run over 26.5%. Both of the final 2 years, he got it up to 29.3% in the final year. Profile was always good from the small sample rookie year. It improved over time, which you want to see. It sounds absurd, but I kind of don't understand how there was even a debate whether he was the best wide receiver in this class. I really do like Carnell Tate. I have my issues with Carnell Tate. I really do like Jordan Tyson, but both of those guys have some ball in hand issues. They have some red flags. This is a profile that looks so can't miss in all the ways that you want it to look. And then the Eagles are the team that said, like, yeah, he went lower in draft capital, but the Eagles are the best drafting team of the last decade, and they said, this is an awesome value. We're going to take Mekhi Lemon. Anyway, it is absurd, but I'm wrong often with the prospect stuff. But as far as the stuff that I looked at, he's not just better than the two guys that went ahead of him and the other first-round rookie receivers that went behind him. He's sort of in a different tier as the one profile that doesn't have any red flags and feels so versatile, so high floor plus high ceiling. I mean, I just really think this is what you look for in a wide receiver prospect. And so as far as the projection that you were talking about in year one and those things, the big question, so I still end up projecting DeVonta Smith as a step forward because DeVonta Smith's a good football player, man. Consistent per route profile, above average yards per target. He's not been great, and that's due to like limited ball in hand, but it's not horrible for how small he is. His catch rates are always strong. He's a good football player. He turns his opportunities into good yardage, but not elite yards per targets necessarily because of the ball in hand stuff not being necessarily great. But again, he's going to catch a way higher percentage of passes than a guy his size has any right to. That's why the guy won the Heisman. Again, this is an example of a guy whose production was great in college and then has been good at the NFL level. These are the things that I look at. His depth-adjusted racer has always been really solid. That goes back to the really high catch rate. He turns air yards into yards. His targets per out run, though, have never been above 22%. When I wrote field tippers in the early offseason, my expectation was this would be the year it would happen. AJ, because I was already predicting A.J. Brown was going to get traded at that time. I was seeing a career year here. This is a guy who's really good after the catch, yards per target, after the target is earned in terms of yards per target and all that stuff, but has not had the massive target per route yet. And if A.J. Brown's gone and he's the clear number one, then there's finally volume here, and he'll probably maintain some degree of the efficiency because of the way that he has always done that. I think Mekhi Lemon complicates that a little bit, so I sort of split the difference. I thought I was going to wind up a lot higher on DeVonta Smith's target rate before doing the projection, before they landed Mekhi Lemon and understanding that second receiving profile. I will say on Wicks, they say the separation stood out for him. It's there in the targets per out numbers. The efficiency's always been the concern. They only sent a fifth and a sixth for him. He got $9 million in fully guaranteed money tacked onto his deal, but his deal was previously a very small deal. They actually did that and added void years at the back. It flattens his cap hit the next couple of years. They get it down to 2.3 mil this year, 3.6 mil next year. To me, this the trade compensation and the way that they did the money doesn't read like they think he's some huge player. I'm hearing some stuff that he might be ahead of Lemon. This is to me, what was it? BC Johnson and Justin Jefferson as rookies that year. It's this is the BC Johnson of the situation. I was excited to see that you guys are as low as I am, sub 50 targets on Wicks, because I was because the number threes in the Philly offense have often been very, very low based on how they do run heavy stuff, and they do the play action off of it, and they throw, and kind of Hurts is kind of a one or two read guy, and then he's either going to run or maybe he ends up taking a sack. They can throw, they can really concentrate on, it's typically A.J. Brown or DeVonta Smith or Dallas Goedert, and then famously whenever one of those guys is out, the other guys just still get all the work. And Jahan Dotson was in number 3, he never did anything. I almost want to take even more off of Wicks to give to Lemon and DeVonta Smith. Now that I see that you guys are in the realm of where I was, because I was I feel like I have a huge gap between Lemon and Wicks, but you guys are pretty similar there. But to me, Wicks is, he's an interesting player with the targets per out run stuff and the separation. Philly's an offense where number 3 receivers go to die is kind of the way that I think about that. And again, I want to be so high on Lemon, and I also think DeVonta Smith's a really good player. I'm trying to figure out the gap between those two in terms of targets. I looked at my Saints projection, and I had a similar gap to Olave and Tyson, which is, I think Smith's probably a little bit better than Olave on a per route or target basis, efficiency. However you want to define that. Olave's a volume hog is part of it. And then I think Lemon may be a little bit better than Tyson. So I was trying to figure that out. It's tricky. I do think these two receivers are probably going to dominate volume by the end of the year. And then for Lemon, it also may be one of these things where early in the year he's not at the peak of what he's going to become, but it progresses forward and we get the back-weighted production, which we often do with rookies. If he went on a Amon-Ra St. Brown back half of his rookie season run like Amon-Ra did late that rookie year, I don't think that should surprise anybody. This guy's got a really interesting profile.
And again, it has been tough for us because we do all love the talent. It's just the opportunity has been tougher for us to cling on to here. And Mekhi Lemon was a predominantly slot only player as his last season, up closer to 70% in the slot, 28% out wide. So with a team that projects to be pretty middling in 11 personnel usage and then doesn't expect to have a lot of pass attempts as a whole, I do think you need Lemon to be very efficient in terms of a yards per target standpoint. And that is a spot you mentioned, Gretch, that we're behind. You were at 8.0, you're at 8.5. So maybe that's the spot we could come up. You also have 8 rush attempts for Lemon. We don't have any for Lemon, which is probably an oversight on our part. We should probably get him some looks in the rushing department just because he is a great ball in hand guy. And you mentioned Howie Roseman alluded to that as well there. But the Wicks deal being $9 million guaranteed this year, I thought was noteworthy. And then the Marquise Hollywood Brown was 1 year, $5 million fully guaranteed as well. So it's not, I don't think at the end of the day, those guys are going to be big roadblocks to Lemon, especially if he does, continue to show that talent throughout the course of the season, but it's not the worst competition or contract situation there for Lemon to overcome.
Good point there. I will note, I strongly doubt they expected Mekhi Lemon to be available to them when they drafted him.
Yeah.
They have to make those free agent decisions earlier in the offseason, obviously.
For sure. And it was that draft day scenario where like the Steelers had called Lemon telling him they were going to take him with the next pick, and then the Eagles jumped up ahead of him. So I do think it was kind of that, oh, hey man, this guy's still here. We can get him for decent draft capital. Like let's do it. And I think the career trajectory for Lemon is extremely strong. Does that come to fruition in his rookie year? I think we are just a little bit more skeptical on that than the rest of the market is at this point in time. All right, let's go to the tight end room with Dallas Goedert and then Eli Stowers added here. In terms of inputs, we're at 78 targets on Goedert. Gretch is at 71. We're at 33 targets on Eli Stowers. Gretch is at 50. So quite a big difference there between the two. We are, certainly expecting Goedert to kind of hold down more of that tight end one inline role, whereas Eli Stowers projects as just kind of, more of like a jumbo slot receiver than an inline tight end at this point of his career. He was a converted quarterback to play tight end, so he's only had 3 seasons at tight end, but very athletic, 23 years old out of Vanderbilt here. But Goedert is a guy who saw his touchdown spike massively last year. He had 11 touchdowns, which was more than his previous 3 seasons combined. Historically, he's been a pretty modest touchdown rate guy. So we have docked Goedert's algo projection on the TD rate, thinking last year was a bit of an outlier production season, but Goedert has been very consistent in terms of per game output at the tight end position. Last year was tight end 5, in 2024 tight end 11, then tight end 13, tight end 5, tight end 10 the last 5 years. But I would say the biggest knock on Goedert, he hasn't played more than 15 games since 2018. So constantly nicked up, hasn't put together necessarily a full season here. But Jack, we do have a pretty massive gap on Goedert and Stowers compared to Gretch. Gretch is 17 targets ahead on Stowers and 7 behind us on Goedert. Any read on this tight end room?
Yeah, Stowers is another guy we've been low on all offseason. I like the receiving profile a lot. I mean, it's hard not to, but this is one that I feel better about being low than someone like Lemon, who I agree with Gretch is just a really strong talent. The Eagles re-signed Goedert to a 1-year deal, so I think that they're kind of showing that their plans are for Goedert to have the role this year and Stowers next year. Like you said, Goedert's been really consistent over the past 3 years, 18% target share in 2023, 19% each of the last 2 years. He does have a big targets per out run without A.J. Brown, but that's partially inflated by him playing some games without Brown and Smith. With DeVonta Smith on the field and Brown off, that drops to a 23% target per out run, 18% target share, which is more in line with his seasonal numbers. On Stowers, I just think it's kind of going to be a developmental year. He won the Mackey Award winner. He's an unbelievable pass catcher. I think that maybe, especially in this offense that wants to run the ball so much, I think that it makes sense to develop him a little bit. Jimmy Kemsky kind of made it sound like it's going to be that way. He said that Goedert and Johnny Munt are both clearly ahead of him on the depth chart. He said as a rookie, there's no way the Eagles can line Stowers at tight end and ask him to block professional edge defenders at this stage of his development. He reportedly hasn't had a very buzzy offseason. Per Kemsky was pretty quiet in the early parts of the offseason. It's nothing on him as a pass catcher. I just think that with the way this offense functions and how run heavy they want to be, I think being purely a pass catcher as a tight end 2 isn't an ideal fit. I think if Goedert goes down, he'd be clearly the most interesting of the backup tight ends, despite Kemsky saying Munt is ahead at this point. But I think that the Eagles are kind of telegraphing how they want their tight end room to go over the next few years, with Goedert being on a 1-year deal and Stowers being signed as a more developmental long-term piece. But Gretch is significantly higher than us. So I'm curious to hear what he has to say as like a counter argument there.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right on this one. I got a little carried away with a little bit of Stowers hype, but the Goedert profile, I'll give you some negative notes on Goedert is the reason for this. I tend to project health, but I mean, I have to cop to thumbing the scale here and wanting to come in low on Goedert. This is a guy who has not played every one of his team's games since his rookie season in 2018. So the target stuff is really strong. His targets per game, I read it every year in my projections, I've been the same number Like his whole career. It's like between like 5.1 and 5.5. Like every single game this guy's played his entire career. It's absurd. And every year on this show, and then when I do my projections, I say if he plays every game, he's going to have a career year because he's going to finally run 450 routes, which he's never done. And he's gonna turn that really consistent target per game number and target share number, however you want to break it down. It's the same stats, right? He earns targets at a meaningful level. Although I will say, his targets per out run fell more than 4.5 percentage points last year from the year prior. His yards per target fell. His yards per route run dropped drastically from the 2024, which was a 2.20 yards per out run, but on a small route sample. And in 2023 and 2025, he's had bigger route samples, and he's been much worse in yards per route run. Those are his 2 career lows in the past 3 years, and they're the bigger samples. And so there is a concern there. I was surprised when I went into this to learn that he turns 32 in January. I didn't realize. I mean, Dallas Goedert to me is still the like backup to Zach Ertz that just came up. I don't know. I don't know how he's this old. He played 15 games last year. It was tied for the most he's played in several years. The year prior, he played 10, 14, 12, 15, 11, 15. It's been 7 straight years where he's missed multiple games or at least one. I think one of those 15 games way back in the day was when they only had 16-game seasons, right? But he's been missing time. His missed tackles forced per touch has been down both the past couple of years relative to his prime efficiency years. And he did used to be a guy who would rip off huge yards per target, over 10, and we're down at like 7.2 this year. And then 2 years prior, the other big route sample, 7.1. In between there, he had a 9.5. So, I mean, he did bounce back. But again, it was a small route sample, about half. He only played the 10 games that year. And so there's this concern about age. But I agree with what Jack said about the kind of the multi-year plan there and Stowers being a little bit more developmental. I just kind of wanted to thumb the scale to be a little bit lower on Goddard. I'll cop to it. One of the things I'll note on the touchdowns very much was some manufactured stuff when they were struggling with the sneaks. They did a bunch of shovel passes and stuff. Starting from the goal line, these were his closest ones. He had 11 TDs. I'm going to read off the shortest 8. 1 yard, 2 yards, 2 yards, 3 yards, 4 yards, 4 yards, 5 yards, and 6 yards. He had 8 from 6 and closer, and he had 6 from 4 and closer. I mean, they were all within the 5-yard line primarily, which like the year prior, he only had 2 touchdowns there, both 14-plus yards of depth. The last time he had a TD reception inside the 5-yard line before last year was way back in 2022. He only had 1 that year. It's not like he's always caught a bunch of balls from the 2 and the 3-yard line. This is actually something that's never happened because they QB sneak every time they get inside the 5, and then suddenly he got all of it there. It's tough to bet on. Yeah, he had 2 touchdowns in the postseason game, a 1-yard rushing touchdown as well in the postseason game. So anyway, in terms of what he is going forward, you have to be aware of the missed time limitations. You can bet on that. I think in managed leagues where you're like whenever he's on the field, he's a pretty good per game guy. You can make that bet. I do think you have to be a little bit concerned about age, some of the efficiency drop-off that I was talking about, and there is just a little bit of a downward trend here. And then if the tight end stuff that was very manufactured isn't there this year, I think the fantasy scoring could actually be quite low. As far as Stowers, they also signed Munt and Stone Smart, so they're getting deep in tight end room for sure here. We may see the multiple tight end stuff, and if we do see that, Eli Stowers may be able to split out a little bit more, and the blocking concerns maybe not there. We talked about Sadiq on the last show and how Sadiq is the best athlete at tight end ever. He ran the fastest 40 time and all that. He had these elite jumps and everything. Sadiq broke the 40 time record for tight ends at the combine. Stowers and his jumps at RAS are 9.9. Stowers jumped 2 inches higher on the vert, and he's actually an inch taller as well. Stowers broke the vert record. He also broke the broad jump record for tight ends at the combine. So both these guys are athletic freaks, the top 2 tight ends in this class. He had a 4.5 140. Sadiq was at 4.39. I mean, it's not that much far behind. It's 0.12 behind. His 10-yard and 20-yard split were actually 0.05, 5/100ths, half of a tenth of a second behind. Eli Stowers is an elite athlete as well, similar to some of the Sadiq stuff. But what we have with him as well is elite per route production, which we didn't really have with Sadiq. Now, he's a lot older, I'll note, because as Jack noted, he was a quarterback early in his career in college. He transferred twice. But when he got to tight end, quickly earned volume, real volume, over 25% targets per out all 3 years, multiple strong yards per out run years. I just think this guy's good at the game. There's talk from the the GM from Roseman about his QB instincts helping his feel on the field as a runner. We've seen that with like Julian Edelman and stuff. I do like Jack's notes from Kemsky and some of the beats that like there's a little bit more developmental needed here, especially on the blocking side. There's a lot of room to improve here still, as they're talking about. The fact that he went to tight end and immediately was that dominant from a target perspective and a production perspective speaks to a real high ceiling for this player. And again, gets back to the Eagles. A lot of people had him as a first round pick. He goes in the second round. Eagles will always take the like very talented prospect that the rest of the league is letting slide. And I think they did it again here. I think he could be an interesting late round guy if they do utilize him a little bit more in year one, even despite some of Jack's concerns, especially if Goddard's age and injury stuff really become a problem. But I do think everything Jack said is better than my projection, and I'm literally changing targets back over to Goddard as Jack was talking.
Yeah, this is a little off topic, but I think Stowers could be a decent dynasty buy like partway through the season because of the stuff Kemsky mentioned. When we were talking about that in our Slack, Silva brought up that he thinks Stowers might not be active in week one, which is obviously would be a bad look for a second round rookie, but I think that it would kind of fit the Eagles' long-term plan and would not be something you want to overreact to. So just kind of a note on keeping the long view with Stowers if it starts out pretty ugly.
In free agency, it kind of seemed like the Eagles were going to move on from Dallas Goedert and then ended up, not signing any other tight ends. They were linked to like David Njoku for a little bit, passed on that, and then kind of signed Goddard a little bit late to that 1-year deal. So I think it's mostly, as you guys have alluded to, like, hey, let's run it back with this crew. And, while we have kind of this Super Bowl window and keep a veteran in the tight end room in Goddard, but certainly expect him to miss some games. And then down the line, expect, Stowers to emerge as the primary pass catcher there. All right, let's go to the Washington Commanders, our third team of this division. Dan Quinn remains the head coach here, but we have a new offensive coordinator and play caller in David Blau, a youngster, if I will, 1 year younger than me. Pour one out for us old guys as offensive coordinators are officially younger than me in the NFL this year. But Cliff Kingsbury gone in this system. Obviously, Jayden Daniels, a bit of a sophomore slump season, mostly due to injury, but also kind of had his metrics down across the board in terms of passing efficiency. So hoping for a year 3 bounce back as Jayden Daniels is one of our like players we're highest on the market on it at this point of the offseason. But on a team level standpoint, we're at 61.4 plays on Washington. Gretch is at 63.1. We're at a 59.4% pass rate. Gretch at 59.5%. So pretty much identical pass rates, but Gretch a little bit more optimistic on the play calling. I do think that is probably the biggest thing to talk about here because Cliff Kingsbury has consistently run such fast offenses that typically produce, decent play volume. In 2024, the Commanders were second in real plays per game. That dipped all the way to 28th last season. Again, I think a lot of that due to the Jayden Daniels in and out of the lineup and just the lackluster quarterback play. But certainly I think, the high-end outcome is on the table here if Blau kind of, runs it in the same mold as Cliff. So, Jack, curious your thoughts on the team level inputs here for the Commanders.
Yeah, I think the pace is going to be down a little bit. Thorman seemed like he agreed. He noted that all 4 seasons as the Cardinals head coach and both seasons in Washington, Cliff Kingsbury's teams were leading the league in no huddle rate. Now you've got David Blau coming over who worked under Kingsbury, but also is likely, or I should say potentially influenced by his playing career. He last played under Ben Johnson for the Lions in 2023. He had some exposure to Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota as well. He's kind of talking about a lot of the stuff that the sharper, younger Ben Johnson type guys are doing with more pre-snap motion, more under center play action. The Commanders were relatively low in motion rate last year. I think that if we see more motion, that kind of eats into the seconds per snap stuff. So we're projecting a lower pace this year for Washington, which I feel okay about with Cliff gone. And that's just kind of where we come in.
I read Thorman's like a little bit different. I read like everything he said about Kingsbury that they're going to be slower, but he noted that they will likely be somewhat slower this year, but there will still be plenty of real estate between where they were under Cliff and a league average pace. And then he talks about Blau having some exposure to some different stuff, and he finishes, saying that Dan Quinn said we'll see Daniels huddle more often, but if a potentially faster Ben Johnson offense is on the table, it might just be something we're interested in. I thought that was a little bit more optimistic in my read, and Quinn had some quotes as well. And when asked about like what Blau would do, when I was reading through the Coach Speak Index stuff, there's my mandated Coach Speak Index shout out for each show. And he just made a comment about how Jayden Daniels can play in all offenses. And so the way that I'm reading this is, I originally thought the Kingsbury firing was tough, given how good Daniels was in 2024. He was very successful, and then he gets hurt a lot, last year, and they had some weird games where he didn't even play very much. Like they had a game against Minnesota where Minnesota had some really long drives. They had like a 90-something yard drive in the first half, and then Washington had some long drives, but turned it over like deep in Minnesota territory twice. And then like Jayden Daniels hurt his elbow, and they're like, all right, we're just pulling you out of the game, and we're going to just like quit playing for the rest of this game. It was like one of those games where teams just packed it in because Minnesota had really kind of like blown them out early in the game, and both teams had like no possessions. I remember writing about and stealing signals because I was high on the game environment, I think, that week or something for DFS or whatever it was. And then I remember watching it and being like, they didn't even play a game. What happened? Because they ended up like Jayden Daniels only ran like 2 possessions before halftime, and then he was out of, and that was it. There was nothing. Anyway, they had some of that stuff because they were kind of trying to protect him. They were kind of doing some weird stuff. The season wasn't going great. I still think Jayden Daniels is legit great. I think he was legit great as a rookie. Like part of the reason I'm high on this offense is I think they're going to bounce back this year because Jayden Daniels is him. Like that's where I'm at. So that's definitely part of it. Obviously, I understand that there's huge concerns with his ability to stay healthy. That was in the prospect profile coming out. He got banged up in his rookie season. He got banged up last year. I don't believe there's a cap on his ceiling when he's on the field. I do think he's a superstar when healthy. I think that long view to the college data suggested that as well. It's just a question of health, but I'm mostly presuming health. And when I presume health, I'm looking at this. And so to get back to the Blau thing, he was on staff the last 2 years. I didn't really realize this when they first made the hire, but he was on staff the last 2 years as an assistant quarterbacks coach. They hired from within. He's supposed to bring more under center stuff and play action, but the way that I looked at it was like it was a move to iterate off of what Kingsbury's already done, not change drastically. My initial concern, like I said, was why would you change this whole offense with the RPOs and the things that Daniels does so well? Because he's like as good as Tua at diagnosing pre-snap, pulling, throwing to the perimeter. They had such good catch and run efficiency in 2024, in addition to the running backs getting really great rushing efficiency because of everything they were doing with this spread offense that, again, we talked about like teams are moving more toward the under center, but not every team's going to do that constantly. When they're in the 2-minute drill, I think this team's still going to play up tempo out of the shotgun, and that kind of stuff. It's something that Daniels does incredibly well. I think he manages that pre-snap process as well as any quarterback in the league. From his rookie season, he had done that and is able to understand where the defense is shaded and where there's numbers advantages, whether the ball needs to get to the perimeter, whether he hands off to the running back, whatever. So anyway, I do think it's going to slow down from Kingsbury because of the more under center stuff, more play action. I am predicting a slight run lean here. I have the actual pass rate right at the 2024 levels. It's up from the 2025 with the injuries and stuff. But I think if I miss this, I would lean toward them passing even more and being a little bit more fast-paced in that direction. So that's where I was reading the Blau stuff. But it is what it is. I also want to note Thorne. A lot of the other stuff that I had been looking at for O-lines before Thorne came out had them below average. Thorne had them at 12, which got me pretty excited as well because I trust him more than anybody.
Yeah, I thought that was a big rank as well. And Sam Cosmi, he mentions, as being like one of the elite players on this line. He was injured coming into last season, started the year on PUP, and will theoretically have a fully healthy offseason. And Larry Tunsil at left tackle, Thorne thinks is one of the premier tackles in the league.
I'll add in that Gretch just had a very unique circumstance in which he complimentarily said as good as Tua.
That's the one thing Tua does incredibly well is the short, quick Yeah, you don't. The short, quick accuracy is Tua's whole game. That's all he has.
On Jayden, though, it mentioned it at the top of this team that he's been a player we've kind of we've been substantially ahead of a market on him this offseason. I've been drafting a ton of him, and he's even one where like when we did our first round of projections this spring, we came in almost like a full round higher in terms of our projection. We're like, man, we kind of have to dial this back, otherwise we're going to be like 22 spots ahead of ADP on Jayden Daniels. Right now we're 10 spots ahead on Underdog, but the rushing profile is pretty nutty here for Jayden Daniels. He's had close to a 13% scramble rate in his first two NFL seasons while maintaining efficient scrambling numbers there at 7.3 yards per carry on those scrambles, and we're only projecting a 10% scramble rate. Again, we kind of just like dial that back. We're expecting a little bit of regression because you don't see too many full-time starting quarterbacks scramble at that rate. So it is interesting. I think like probably the biggest knock on Jayden's fantasy outlook is the pass catcher core here. You have Terry McLaurin and they drafted Antonio Williams, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot to get excited about. I think this is a spot we are expecting a free agent signing to occur. Obviously, the Brandon Ayuk steam was ongoing for a while, but it seems like that has fizzled quite a bit. But there are several veterans out on the free agent market that could sign here, which I think would help solidify Jayden's passing outlook here. But in terms of projections, we're at 63.3% completion rate on Jayden Daniels. Gretch is at 67%, so quite a bit higher. In terms of rush attempts, we're at 124 for 600 yards. Gretch is at 134 for 670 yards. We are a little bit higher on the rushing touchdown department, but again, I felt like we had to dial this back in order to not be even further ahead of market. So really, really love Jayden Daniels in drafts this year. Jack, anything to add on the Daniels profile?
Yeah, I love Jayden Daniels in drafts. I think we've talked about, especially last episode with the NFC East, kind of what quarterbacks have this true game-breaking ceiling. We talked about Drake May potentially, despite being a very good rusher, not having quite that ceiling to like break fantasy football as the overall QB1. I think Jayden Daniels clearly has that upside. This is a guy who averaged 6 yards per carry on 148 regular season carries as a rookie, and he was playing through injury for part of that. He had an 18% designed run rate in week 1 before getting hurt in week 2, and then when he came back, despite playing a little bit injured, he had 3 straight 13% games after that. In the couple of games he played after that, they basically stopped running him. But you mentioned the scramble rate. It was actually up last year from 11.8% in 2024 to 15.6% last year. That 15.6% is nowhere near sustainable, but the point remains that he is one of the highest volume scramblers in the league. I think that there's some optimism that the Blau offense can provide more passing efficiency. Gretch is significantly higher than us from a yards per attempt standpoint, which I don't really mind. We're kind of closer to his career numbers. But I think if they're doing more play action and more motion and more creative stuff, I think that you could see the passing efficiency come up despite the wide receiver core, which I agree is a concern. But they still have time to sign a Stephon Diggs or someone like that. So yeah, I think that Daniels is one of maybe 3 quarterbacks, if you throw in Josh Allen and Lamar, with the true high outcome as their ceiling. And so we have him as the QB3. I think that he's going slightly behind May on Underdog, but we're almost a round ahead of his Underdog ADP, and I feel pretty good about it. The risk is there with the injuries and all that stuff. I agree that the floor is maybe not the same as a Drake May or a Joe Burrow or those guys, but I think when we're playing for ceiling, I think Daniels is in a different atmosphere than those guys.
I'm equally stoked. I love that you guys have more rushing TDs for him, and I'm tweaking my projections so I can just give him a rushing TDs sight unseen because you guys are almost 2 ahead of me. The rushing volume is the really interesting one, especially in a league where I just talked about how Hurts was down like 2+ rush attempts per game from his previous career low. We talked about on the AFC North show that Lamar Jackson was way down from his previous career low. He played hurt last year. He had been 8.4 rush attempts per game every other year of his career, was down to 5.2 last year. I'm projecting both Hurts and Jackson about 7.5. I'm projecting Daniels at 7.9. And so to lead the league in rushes per game from a quarterback, he was at 8.3 rush attempts per game last year after 9.2 as a rookie. Still young. We see guys as they age tend to run a little bit less. Sometimes we don't have as much of a track record on aging mobile QBs because that really just exploded, and then we're just starting to see those guys get older. But that was the case for some of the previous generation of somewhat mobile quarterbacks. But like Lamar has still typically ran until last year. Anyway, even though Daniels played hurt a little bit last year, he was still at 8.3 per game. I got him at 7.9. I got him below both of the last 2 years. For Lamar and Hurts, I'm projecting them to rebound from 2025, but still be below Daniels. That's just trying to drive home that if you want to talk about range of outcomes type stuff, there are scenarios, I think, where Daniels is running a lot more than any other quarterback. I don't know that they want that because of the health stuff, right? So that's the important thing. But just in terms of looking at the numbers, guys play how they play. Jack talked about the really high scramble rate. One of the reasons I was really high on him as a rookie is I went through his scramble rates all the way back to Arizona State in college. They were always high. That year it was him versus Anthony Richardson, who was going a lot higher. And Anthony Richardson didn't have high scramble rates in college, but everyone was like, look at how athletic he is. He's obviously a good rushing quarterback. That's not how it really works. You're talking about within the context of a play and reading it out and finding space. It's not just how fast you can run. You have to be a ball handler as well. And Jayden Daniels has had that all throughout his college career and now both years of his NFL career, even when he's playing hurt, even when, keeping him healthy seems like a key point. He has still run a ton. As far as the passing efficiency that I'm higher on, he played a little bit hurt last year, as I mentioned, had kind of the weird year. He also had Terry McLaurin out for most of the year, and this is like his only good receiver. His completion percentage really fell, which I think is basically the entire reason that his yards per attempt and TD rate came down, because you're talking about per attempt. His yards per completion was actually up a touch in year 2 from year 1. So when he actually got the connection, and like guys like Jalen Lane, I was excited about Jalen Lane. Jalen Lane had a ton of drops last year. Like Jayden Daniels was having some issues. I don't know if those came from Mariota or Daniels, but he was having some issues at the receiving side of things. Now, Washington is trying to let this extremely exciting player go his whole career without ever giving him any players. Like the Patriots went out and got AJ Brown and all that stuff. He's like they ran out the corpses of Deebo Samuel and Zach Ertz last year as the number 2 and number 3, and then we obviously see Terry McLaurin get hurt, and it's like, great, what does he have? And this year they've made very minor improvements. Frankly, I'm pretty annoyed once again at Washington for not thinking that this guy has anything or needs any help. But and he'll also have to do more under center, which changes things a bit. But I believe in the skill set. I believe in his ability to throw short and deep. That was the big thing in the rookie season, the deep efficiency in addition to the quick short area accuracy. Like I said, that's all Tua has. And, Mike McDaniel was able to leverage that enough that they were able to win some games early into his career. People thought Tua was a much better quarterback than he ever was, frankly, just because of that one skill set. It adds a lot when you get the ball out in the short area on time. The catch and run is there. Daniels has had that on the other end with like basically every receiver that he's thrown to over the couple years as well. When he's had the short completions, there's been some catch and run on the other side of that. So I'm really, really high on the skill set on the passing side. That's why I come out so high. And then the rushing side, I mean, again, he could wind up leading the league in rushing yards by a lot if Lamar's not pushing that. I think those are the two guys who, when you look at their career, the rush attempts and the rush efficiency on the yardage side get really, really high. And then it's Allen and Hurts on the touchdown side. But yeah, we'll see how that all plays out.
Let's get into the skill groups here, because both the running back and wide receiver room are some of the most muddled in the league. Like there's just a lot of bodies to sift through here projection wise, I think. So let's start in the running back room. They bring in Rachaad White on a 1-year deal, $2 million contract with $1.7 million guaranteed. They have Jacory Krosky-Merritt as kind of like the incumbent RB1 here, was a 7th round pick for them in 2025. They draft Katron Allen in the 6th round of the season. Then they also signed Jerome Ford to a 1-year, $1.4 million contract, only like $440K guaranteed in that deal though. But they also bring back Jeremy McNichols, who was on the team last year. He's on a 1-year, $1.5 million contract with $560K guaranteed. So in my view, you have, Katron Allen and Jacory Krosky-Merritt as the most likely early down rushing backs, whereas Rachaad White, Jerome Ford, and McNichols all profile more as pass catchers. But Rachaad White has handled a lot of rushing work in his career as well. So I don't want to completely write him off there for like the base down rushing work. But in terms of inputs here, we're at 103 rush attempts on Rachaad White. Gretch is at 131. We're at 41.5 targets on White. Gretch is at 54. On Jacory Krosky-Merritt, we're at 152 carries. Gretch is at 173. We're both pretty low on the targets there, though. We're at about 15 targets for JCM, and Gretch is at 18. And then on Katron Allen, just want to note this because we are a bit higher on him across the board. We're at 62 rush attempts and 15 targets, while Gretch is at 28 rush attempts and 5 targets there on Katron. So again, it's a lot of bodies to sift through. Tough to find, or tough to completely nail down the roles. I'm eager to get some training camp news on this Commanders backfield here soon. But Jack, take us through your thoughts on this Washington backfield.
Yeah, Rachaad White has been the subject of some hype this offseason. I'm not really buying it from a rushing perspective. Career 3.9 yards per carry. It seems like he's had opportunities to separate as an early down runner and never really taken advantage of it last year. Taken advantage of it so far. Last year, when Bucky Irving went down, he started as the clear RB1, but by the time Bucky got back, Sean Tucker had made serious inroads and actually out-carried Rachaad White 39-27 over the final 3 games before Bucky came back. I do think Rachaad White is a good pass catcher. 1.44 yards per out run in 2024. His receiving numbers were down a little bit last year, but it seems like everywhere he goes, teams kind of rave about his pass catching and pass blocking ability. So I think that he's going to be the third down back here. I'm not totally buying the idea that he can be a 3-down workhorse. I think we've just tried that before and it hasn't really come to fruition. Jacoby Krosky-Merritt, obviously a very interesting offseason last year and a pretty interesting season as well. 4.6 yards per carry, 3.5 yards after contact per attempt. I think that's a very impressive rookie year, given that he was a late round NFL draft pick. But it was a weird season. The Commanders went back to Chris Rodriguez at the end of the year. Chris Rodriguez was kind of dinged up over the back half of the season, but he out-carried JCM in the final 5 games that he played. And JCM was also a total 0 as a pass catcher last year, 13% targets per out run, 0.65 yards per out run. I think that the decision to bring in Rachaad White kind of ends a lot of the hope that the JCM can emerge as a 3-down back. I know there's been some talk this offseason that they want him to do that, but they really did not seem to trust him in that regard last year. And then they bring in Rachaad White. Katron Allen, they added 5'11", 216, 769 career college carries. I think that if JCM falters, potentially we start to see him get involved. I don't think that he's going to be very involved early, but at this point, it seems like a pretty ambiguous backfield, so I'm not ruling out Allen becoming a factor later in the season. Dane Brugler did note that it doesn't project to have much of a special teams role, so with the amount of running back bodies they have here, that could leave him inactive in week 1. Jerome Ford, McNichols, I'm kind of just treating as depth guys. I know McNichols had a couple, or at least one long run last year, but it kind of seems like they've settled on JCM as their early down RB1, at least brought in Rachaad White for pass down. So I'm not really expecting much from him this year. Jerome Ford, very cheap contract. It seems like Rachaad White is probably better at the pass catching role that they could have used Jerome Ford for. So I'm thinking it'll be White on pass downs, JCM on early downs, Katron Allen likely not having much of a role early, but potentially figuring in late if they're not happy with what they're getting on early downs.
Yeah, that's go ahead.
I was just going to say, to the ambiguous backfield point, like we've been behind on both Rachaad White and JCM to this point, a little bit ahead on Katron Allen, which I don't love, especially seeing that Gretch has the touches more condensed on White and Krosky-Merritt. So I am eager, Gretch, to hear your thoughts on just kind of the role distribution and how you see it break it down.
Well, I think Katron Allen's profile is a little bit intriguing. Pretty decent little rushing profile, poor receiving efficiency, decent size, didn't test. His calling card is, as Jack said, had a lot of work. 900 plus yards from scrimmage, 4 straight years of college. I mean, he can obviously do things. I like production. Like I always talk about that, even at running back. I mean, but I do think it's a little bit of a jack of all trades, master of none type of profile. It's maybe part of. I didn't see if he didn't test because of an injury or not. I wanted to look into that. I forgot to, but. I got the impression it was maybe similar to like Jonah Coleman, who's like that, who basically was like, I don't want you to know how slow I am. And I was watching Katron Allen and on film, and I was like, this guy's not like super explosive. So that's probably the other reason that I felt that way. And then a round 6 pick. And then to Jack's point, you have McNichols, you have Ford. Those guys are more, they're going to do more on special teams potentially and different things. McNichols has been there for a long time. Ford got the small contract. I only projected 4 running backs because I only have like so many flex spots, and I had to use one of my flex spots for wide receivers, which we'll get to. They have a lot of players that you should project. I don't have enough in my spreadsheet to handle it, so I didn't. You guys have 5 projected here running backs. I only have 4. But to Jack's point, Katron Allen may be inactive if they think Ford and McNichols are guys they want active at the 3 and the 4. If they get 4 guys active, I think it's going to be pretty consolidated on White and JCM. My optimism on White, and I've always been a White hater, like legit. I was not that. I like the profile coming out. I don't like watching him. Like from a film perspective, I think he's stuck in concrete when he gets the ball on any handoff. He's so slow back to the line. And I was a big Bucky Irving guy from pre-rookie season, as listeners of the show will remember. And so, you naturally have to hate Rachaad White if that's the case. The fact that he's so slow and the yards before contact are so bad, so slow back to the line of scrimmage, as his biggest weakness, I actually weirdly think is a reason to like him more, because every Washington running back in this offense seems to get explosive runs. Chris Rodriguez got him. You mentioned Jeremy McNichols got him. JCM immediately got him last year. Austin Eckler bounced back efficiency-wise after leaving the Chargers and was getting I'm forgetting someone, but like every dude that's played, Brian Robinson was getting explosive plays in 2024, and then they got rid of him. They're like, this guy's not even good. I think some of those were in the pass game, but like these guys find space. Again, gets back to Jayden Daniels. When you have the QB mobility, it adds to the rushing efficiency, and the way that they pull and throw to the perimeter on the RPOs and the quick hits. I think it spreads defenses horizontally at the line. I think this is the thing that Cliff Kingsbury's offense has done really well, and then that creates running lanes in the middle. Well, Rachaad White is horrible at getting up to speed, but he's actually good in the open field. He's a big back that does have pretty good straight line speed. This is a perfect offense for him. If they can get him some holes to run into that he can take 3 hours to get to, he's going to actually be able to create some big plays once he gets there. And he's had those big plays in the passing game. Rachaad White has always been able in the flat to catch. My favorite skill set for him has always been that he catches and moves forward with the ball. There's a lot of running backs as receivers that just catch the ball and like they're stopped and they have to turn and see the field. Rachaad White will catch the ball and be moving downfield. And if you go look at his receiving efficiency and like his yards per catch and yards after the catch, they've always been really strong. Go back to college, they were good. And I think a big reason for that is despite his slow feet as a runner, as a receiver, he actually gets a head start. He starts moving his feet as he's catching the ball and gets into space quickly, and then is able to create big plays off of that because he actually can. He's a big back. He actually can be pretty good in space. And so as a guy that I, again, don't even necessarily really like, I really like the fit for him, and I'm actually pretty in. I'll also note he had a 1,500-yard season with Jayden Daniels at ASU, as he was the clear best skill position guy there. The Brandon Ayuk tie-in always comes back, but Jayden Daniels trying to get the whole ASU band back together. That's where Rachaad White tie-in comes in as well. And they've been talking all offseason about really liking his pass catching. They also really like Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt. I think people be surprised that just on raw numbers, Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt, who people talked about as like a bust because he had all this optimism, he ran for 800 yards and 8 touchdowns last year as a round 7 rookie. That's really good. They've had a low running back target rate here. I will note that Austin Eckler had 48 in 14 games over the past 2 years for about 3.4 per game. So a guy who has a reason to try to get him the ball in the pass game. They got him the ball in the pass game. So that's part of why I'm bumping Rachaad White's targets up, but I'm pretty low on the rest of the running back targets. White was always at 3.7 targets per game or higher up until last year. He was down to 2.6. Eckler's, I mentioned, was 3.4 per game in his 14 games with Washington over the last 2 years when Jayden Daniels was on the team. I've got White around that range. I don't know exactly where I had him, but it's very similar to that. I think it was the low 3s. But yeah, Bill was only at a 7.9% targets per route. Extremely low. No intent to get him the ball in the passing game. He was solid as a runner. My concern on him is that it's maybe a trap profile again, sort of similar to the Saquon thing. It's like, are you going to get the rushing TDs? I do have him for a high rate there. I don't feel like he's going to get anything receiving because beyond White, Ford and McNichols also have receiving pass down chops in background.
I did want to interject there on kind of like the high value touch discussion, because that to me is where I'm a little bit more afraid of being behind market on Rachaad White, just given that I think he is going to be the primary pass catcher in this offense. And then I do think he probably profiles as like the early week goal line back as well. He's 6 foot 215, whereas JCM is 5'11", 208. But last year they really leaned on Chris Rodriguez inside the 5-yard line. He outcarried JCM 13-8 in that regard. And JCM only had 2 touchdowns out of those 8 touchdowns on the season for him inside the 5-yard line. So a lot of those came from further out. And I also just don't think the path to reasonable pass catching upside is there either. When you have White there, you also have Ford and McNichols, who, McNichols they went to in the routes department down the stretch over JCM last year.
I had the same thought I had the same thought about the goal line work, but that my concern about Rachaad White's yards before contact, that was always like relative to size. That was always the reason I always wanted them to use Bucky more in Tampa, and I think it's why Sean Tucker ultimately got like Chris Rodriguez is a straight line downhill runner, no, doesn't waste energy, a lot like Sean Tucker.
For sure.
They may start White that way, but they may decide by like week 2 that this dude takes way too long to get back to the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, that, and I do think if Katron Allen emerges, it could be as more of a goal line threat. He's a good 10 to 15 pounds heavier than JCM. Also, again, we haven't seen that at the NFL level, but I just see like multiple roadblocks to JCM in terms of the goal line role and the pass catching role, which makes me not love him despite how efficient he was as a rusher in his rookie season. And then we get the Commanders 12th and Thorns offensive line rankings. You have Jayden Daniels, projected to play a full season. Like, this is a valuable backfield that I want some pieces of, and I've haven't loved that we've been like behind market on White and JCM. So I do think that's a spot I kind of want to consolidate a little bit more after this. Again, I would personally lean probably White a little bit more in that conversation, but again, it's 1-2. I hope in training camp we get some clarity on this room. All right, let's go to the wide receiver core. Tons of bodies to sift through here as well. Terry McLaurin leads it off here. He had 1,000 yards for 5 straight seasons prior to last year. Had not missed a game in 4 years before picking up some injuries last year. One thing that did sneak up on me a little bit with Terry McLaurin, he does turn 31 in September this year. So kind of getting to that point in the wide receiver age cliff that we could see some decline. But in terms of efficiency on a yards per target basis, McLaurin has been outstanding the past couple of seasons. Had that breakout year in Jayden Daniels' rookie season as well. So don't have too many concerns, but it is something in the back of my mind there on Terry McLaurin. In terms of our inputs for this wide receiver room, we're at 102 targets on McLaurin. Gretch is all the way up at 132, so pretty massive gap there. On Antonio Williams, we're at 54 targets. Gretch is at 75. And then on Treylon Burks, we're at 49 targets. Gretch is at 21. So massive discrepancies here in the wide receiver room, which honestly I'm not too surprised by, just given our lack of confidence in kind of how this is going to shake out. Treylon Burks did get the routes towards the end of the season, but was not productive in them. Has really struggled to stay healthy since being drafted in the first round by the Titans a few years ago. So, and this is also a spot we are holding some targets back, expecting them to sign a free agent wide receiver. So we haven't distributed, all the targets in this wide receiver room yet. So I think that adds to the discrepancies as well. But just to round out this wide receiver core, they did bring back De'Ami Brown, who, a 1 year kind of hiatus there in Jacksonville. They have Jalen Lane coming into his second season. They have Luke McCaffrey in this room as well. And then Van Jefferson, everyone's favorite route runner and non-producer, gets in this room as well. So tons of bodies to sift through, Jack, but I think we should hit on, probably Terry McLaurin and Antonio Williams, since those are the two fantasy viable wide receivers at this point in time.
Yeah, so Terry's interesting because despite the age, he actually had a 3-year high in targets per out run last year at 24%. But the thing with him is he's been at 21%, 22%, and 20% target shares over the last 3 seasons. I only have his target share data dating back through 2022 right now, but I don't think he's ever had a target share above 24%. He's very, very consistently been in the 20 to 24% target share, I think quite literally every year of his career. And so I don't know if he has true alpha wide receiver 1 ceiling, just because we haven't seen it to this point, and now he's 31. What are the odds that he actually reaches this upper 20% target share for the first time in his career at a more advanced age? I think that he's very dependable. Obviously, he hadn't missed a game over the previous 4 seasons before playing 10 last year. So I think what you're getting out of Terry. There weren't really signs of slowing down last year, so I'm not too worried about that. The touchdowns did drop off a lot last year. Part of that is the strength of the offense, but he had 13 touchdowns in 2024, despite only having 8 targets inside the 10, which didn't rank all that high league-wide. So a lot of that was long touchdowns. So I think that it's unreasonable to expect 13 touchdowns moving forward. And I think that Terry is a solid fantasy wide receiver too, but I question whether he has a true top 6 ceiling. Antonio Williams, 78% of career snaps inside at Clemson. He was a big-time recruit. From what I've read, he's dependable. He gets open. They use him a bit in the rushing game as well. So I think that he's probably the favorite for slot duties, at least as things stand right now. And given that the other names they have are Traylon Burks, Jalen Lane, De'Ami Brown, I think that he has a reasonable path to being Jayden Daniels wide receiver 2 as a rookie if they don't add someone. But I think that they probably will add someone. They've just been rumored to be in maybe not discussions, but it just seems like a reasonable spot for a free agent wide receiver. Obviously, Ayuk had the relationship with Jayden Daniels that he has since burned that bridge, but Stephon Diggs from Maryland still waiting, and I think has been training in the area, so I think that would be a reasonable landing spot for him. So I think a lot of Williams' value comes down to what they do or don't do at wide receiver the rest of the offseason. And Gretch is quite a bit higher than us on Williams, which might just be the difference in we have some unlisted wide receiver target share right now that Gretch might not have. But I think Terry is the big one here to nail down. And I think that the base work is pretty dependable, but the ceiling I do question given that he hasn't shown the ceiling yet.
Yep, love that note on Terry. That's been my take on him for years when I've been writing about him, is that I don't know that there's a real ceiling. I think after his rookie year, I argued that probably on this show that people were double counting the Jayden Daniels effect because he already hit the ceiling when Jayden Daniels is a rookie, and then everyone's like, yeah, he's got the best quarterback of his career. One of the ways that I broke that down was that even with the huge touchdown rate, the 13 TDs or whatever it was, his fantasy finish and his ADP were basically the same number. It was like wide receiver 14 finish and wide receiver 14. He's never had more than 1,100 yards in a season. So the question is, why am I suddenly projecting it now? Because I am meaningfully higher than you guys. Part of that is I am projecting this as if there was no new addition at wide receiver 2. I think we all expect that. At the same time, it has not happened yet. We were recording this on July 22nd. And this team seems to think that they don't need skill position players. So who knows if they think they're actually going to do it. I wrote there's enough of an opening in my notes that at wide receiver 2 that a new addition maybe wouldn't impact my McLaurin projection that much. I think it would probably project or impact Antonio Williams as well as potentially Chigokonkwo, who I have an aggressive projection on as well. Those are the two that I felt like, and then it would really push more. It would concentrate things. I said it would steal from the wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 6 in my projections. The way I handled it, not having that, was pushing a lot of volume down the totem pole. I have several guys for 20-plus targets. I think even more than this, I have Luke McCaffrey in mine as well, than what we have in our comparison sheet here. But as far as McLaurin, he had the really high, astronomically high TD rate in 2024, and there was real TD rate regression last year, and he's coming off his first real injury. At the same time, even though he's turning 31, if I'm going to bet on a 31-year-old receiver, I want it to be somebody who's coming off of career highs in targets per route and yards per route run. We actually did see last year a little bit of something that I was saying going into last year. I didn't think, Terry McLaurin was actually, because I thought it was all touchdowns in Jayden Daniels' rookie year. Last year, he actually jumped to 22.5% targets per route and 2.22 yards per route. Obviously, he got hurt. He missed some time. You noted the target share elements of that. Or that they didn't jump quite as much, but those were career highs for him in the per route stuff, at least. I think he's an efficient player tied to a good quarterback where the ceiling's often been in question, like that whole thing, whether he's great, whether he's just very good. But I am willing to buy in a little bit about it, and also a little bit about the excitement around them potentially moving him around more for the first time in his career. He's always been stuck on one side on the outside, is my understanding. And then this new offense being a little more under center, probably going to a little bit more of heavy tight end stuff. They brought in Okonkwo. They still have Senat and Bates. They're still talking about Ertz like he may play for them this year, even though he's rehabbing an ACL, and it seems like he's not on the roster as far as I can understand.
Well,
they talk.
Yeah, sorry to cut you out. That injury also happened in the Minnesota game, which was week 14, and it was a pretty gruesome injury. I would not expect Ertz back, with any meaningful really role this season.
But then they also have Colson Yankoff, who they talk about favorably. Lawrence Cager, they actually talked about. He's their 5th tight end. They also brought in Anthony Firkser as a free agent tight end and got a UDFA, Quentin Moore. They are trying to get some tight end depth. I feel like they added 2 free agents and they already had a bunch of other dudes on the roster. I think with the under center stuff and the shift towards Shanahan and yada yada, we may see more multiple tight end sets this year, which would then naturally consolidate volume onto the main wide receivers. So I think there is a possibility. To Jack's point, he was saying I don't really know why at age 31 we would suddenly expect him to take this next step, and I've never seen that in Terry McLaurin's profile. I do actually think there's the possibility that it could happen based on the fact that he had, in his injury-plagued season last year, a little bit more of a step forward in the per-out stuff, and then also kind of the way the offense would evolve, maybe moving him around and some of that stuff.
I do think losing Zach Ertz is like an underrated development for the Commanders and Jayden Daniels. When you look at like our target per out run tool with Jayden Daniels at quarterback over the last 2 seasons, Ertz had a pretty similar target per out run to Terry McLaurin. He was at like 20%, whereas McLaurin was at 21%. The last 2 seasons was caught 11 touchdowns, did Zach Ertz over his last two years with the Commanders. So I know it was a bit of a punching bag there, but that was a safety blanket and kind of like, Daniels very consistent number 2 target in the offense. So I do think that is a pretty big void to fill, and it makes sense why I think threw a lot of resources at the tight end position. You mentioned Chig Okonkwo, which I was eager to talk about with you guys because he did sign a 3-year, $27 million contract, close to $17 million guaranteed. He's one of these tight ends that a lot of times we see, it takes till their second contract for them to break out. He's entering year 5 here, turns 27 in September. So kind of like in this profile, I do think there is upside on Chig in terms of our inputs there. We're at 71 targets. Gretch is at 83. So a typical gap that we see, just between our projections. So it's not like Gretch is super high there, but that is a spot that we have consistently like ticked up Chig's target share as the offseason has gone along. He's also, I think, if they did not sign another, wide receiver, would be a bigger beneficiary. You'd probably bump him up like 1 to 2% in base target share if they don't add competition. Again, we've kind of been just holding back targets here with the fear that they sign someone, we end up having to dock everyone as the offseason goes along. So, I do think it is kind of between Chig and Antonio Williams for the second target in this passing game. Gretch has 75 targets on Antonio Williams and 83 on Chig. So Gretch, you see Chig as probably like the the number 2 target in this passing game, and like I said, we've kind of been bumping him up, trying to get closer to market. We're currently around behind ADP on Underdog. He's going at pick 140 overall as a tight end 16. We have him ranked 153rd at tight end 21, so a little bit behind market. And when you look at Chig's profile, he has not been a touchdown scorer to this point in his career, only 2.9% career TD rate, which is, pretty atrocious for the tight end position, but he's also playing for a Titans team that, is one of the lowest scoring touchdown offenses in the league throughout his career. So I don't know whether to like knock him for that as a skill set, or if that's just more of like a team level vibe there for the Titans. But Gretch, how do you view this landing spot for Chig, and do you think that this could be a potential breakout season for him?
Well, I think it's a great landing spot for Chig. You have a great quarterback and you have no number 2 competition as it stands. And that's the way, as I mentioned, I had to make a decision. I decided to project it. I feel like if they were going to bring in Diggs, they may have already done that by this point. I thought Ayuk was going to land there for sure. If I would have done this projection 2 months ago, I probably would have put Ayuk into my projection, but I had to kind of make a decision as I went into it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to project it as they have it standing because we're in late July and they have not brought anyone else in. And from that perspective, Okonkwo does look like he could be the second best guy. He's been a little bit lackluster on the per out stuff in Tennessee, but like not bad, consistently decent. His targets per out run, his yards per target have all been like and I think even his routes run have all been in a very like tight band for like 3 straight years. I think there's room for that to open up in Washington with the new contract. He has good ball and hand skills, which is something I really like with him. As far as Williams, who I kind of skipped over because I have a big projection on him too, but again, it's because I'm not really projecting a number 2. He's an interesting player, maybe limited. He's small but very fast, had a good vert, he's explosive. His ball in hand is just okay for his speed, but it's not terrible. They did use him as a runner and a returner. Like in college, they were trying to get the ball in this guy's hand. It's weird because he had early production too, 600 receiving yards as a true freshman, but then never really hit a ceiling production-wise. And so he had a really high targets per out run, but the ADOT wasn't super high. He's a versatile player. They had him throw a bomb on the first play in one of their games at Clemson, and he threw a dime for a long touchdown. He's done a ton of different stuff. I think they'll find ways to give him the ball. I have him 13 carries as well. They may use him in the return game. I gave him 75 targets on the assumption that there is no number 2 in the offense. So it's a lot of McLaurin, and then I have 83 for Okonkwo. So it's a lot of McLaurin up over 130, and then Okonkwo, and then Williams, and then a lot going to a lot of different places after that. I came in thinking I would be higher on Treylon Burks. He got a lot of work last year, and I thought it was impressive because he probably wasn't in their plans, and he managed to get a lot of work. But then when I was reading the offseason quotes, all they could talk about is Van Jefferson. Every team that brings in Van Jefferson loves the way Van Jefferson practices. None of them will ever learn. Van Jefferson, the bane of my existence. I didn't project Van Jefferson, but I ended up pulling down Burks a little bit because they're also talking about De'Ami Brown, who had a good 2024 with Jayden Daniels. They brought him back. They got Jalen Lane. Jalen lost work as the season went along, but they were talking about him maybe being a year 2 guy. They got Luke McCaffrey, who was actually the most efficient of these random guys last year. And Luke McCaffrey had a fun little profile last year. So I ended up projecting him as the wide receiver, 6. But I didn't project Van Jefferson. It seems like Van Jefferson's actually going to make the team and run a lot of routes, which is good for anyone else running routes because Van Jefferson's terrible.
Yeah, it's so many bodies to sift through here. So I do think it is, like focusing on McLaurin, Antonio Williams, and Chig as the fantasy viable ones. But Jack, in terms of this tight end room, I think the knock on Chig as well is that he had a tough time consolidating snaps in Tennessee. He never had a season over 66% snap share. And then down the stretch, was losing routes last year to Gunnar Helm. And so despite signing the big contract, like, we mentioned a lot of bodies in this tight end room, they also signed John Bates to a 3-year, $21 million contract with $11.5 million guaranteed. So like he's going to be in their plans, even though he's more of a blocker. I'm just like a little bit worried about the overall playing time and route rate for Chig. So curious your thoughts here on Okonkwo.
Yeah, I think the routes are the big question. He's consistently been, in my opinion, a pretty good pass catcher in Tennessee. 21% target per out run. Last year, 20% the year before, 21% in 2023. The yards per target has not been great, 7.4 career yards per target, but I think a lot of that doesn't look as bad when you contextualize it with the fact that he played in one of the worst offenses in the league for his entire playing career. But despite being a solid receiver who I've always liked, he's been at 58% routes for the entire season for each of the last 3 years. He split with Josh Wiley in 2024 and then Gunnar Helm last year. There have been stretches where they've played him for a lot more snaps and had him run a lot more routes than that. I think at the end of 2024, he was posting some really big route rates and some really big target shares to go along with them, which I think got everyone excited, and it got me excited. But they've always kind of dialed it back and never really trusted him in a 3-down role. He's listed at 6'3", 238, which is small for an NFL tight end. So I think having John Bates there as potentially a blocking tight end could eat into his snaps. They've been talking about Chig really positively all offseason. Blau said that Blau's been impressed by Chig's versatility, reportedly. John Keim has reported multiple times that tight ends are expected to be more involved in this offense. And you mentioned Zach Ertz's targets per out run. So there is history of tight ends being involved, and Keim is saying they might be even more involved, which makes sense given the more under center and the more play action. So I think the upside case is there on a per route basis with Chig, and I like him on a per route basis. My only question would be, how many routes is he going to run? The Titans never really trusted him in a true 3-down role. He's small for a 3-down tight end. If you would tell me that he's going to run 75+% of routes, I think I'd be a lot more in on Chig. I don't hate him where he goes as of now, despite our rank, because he has been, in my opinion, a solid pass catcher, and the runway is clear for him to be essentially the wide receiver 2 here if they don't sign someone. But I do think it's notable that the Titans, despite trying him in a 3-down role, have always kind of gone back to playing him in a very part-time role, and they do still have Bates as a blocker there.
All right, let's go to the New York Giants, last team of the division for us to cover, and a lot of turnover here to discuss as well. John Harbaugh in as the head coach, and then Matt Nagy becomes the offensive coordinator and play caller here for the New York Giants. I mean, man, just Matt Nagy getting another crack here at his offensive coordinator as Kansas City pretty much just lets him walk out the door there, had no interest in retaining him. But on a team level here for the Giants, we're at 61 plays. Gretch is at 61.3. We're at a 58.4% pass rate. Gretch at a 59% pass rate. So we're pretty, low on plays per game and pass rate here. We have the Giants 23rd in plays per game and 26th in pass rate. We're kind of looking more towards just how like the Ravens have operated over the years. Not only is Matt Nagy there, but Greg Roman is also an offensive assistant here for the Giants. So Harbaugh kind of, running back with his favorite boys here with the Giants. So I think it's fair to expect a slower paced and higher rushing rate here for the Giants offense. They have the 17th ranked offensive line according to Brandon Thorne. And then, just wanted to note as well on a team level that Baltimore has been dead last in 11 personnel usage by a lot each of the last 2 seasons. And you have Isaiah Likely come over here to the Giants, sign a decent contract, and they also bring back Theo Johnson in the tight end room. So I think we're heading to another offense with a slow pace, higher rush rate, and then multiple tight end sets, which kind of saps some fantasy value here from the secondary players. But Jack, what are your overarching thoughts on the Giants' outlook this season?
Yeah, I mean, they don't have Lamar Jackson or Derrick Henry, so I don't think they're going to be quite as run heavy as those Ravens offenses. But Jaxson Dart is on the record saying, it sounds like we're not going to be throwing the ball a lot. We're going to keep giving it to Cam Skadabu until they can stop it. So I certainly think that they want to run the ball. Pat Thorman sounded pretty pessimistic on the Giants' pace in his pace preview. The Giants' average single game no huddle rate with Jaxson Dart healthy last year was 25%. Thorman tweeted out some really good stats on Dart from a huddle versus the no huddle. From no huddle, he averaged 7.9 yards per attempt, completed 68% of his passes, 4 touchdowns, no picks. When the Giants huddled last year, he averaged 6.4 yards per attempt, 63% completion, 11 touchdowns, 5 picks. So I think that it's an interesting mesh where you'd expect a slower offense here, but Dar was substantially more efficient last year when he didn't huddle. They didn't huddle at Ole Miss. Or they did a lot of no huddle at Ole Miss, I should say. But I think that given the coaching change, we should expect a slower pace than what we saw with Dart last year, and certainly a more run-first offense, given what Dart has said, as well as what this offensive staff has done at previous stops.
And the offseason coach speak on Cam Skadabu has been pretty high consistently from Jordan Harbaugh, and obviously Dart and Skadabu not on the same level as Lamar and Derrick Henry, like you alluded to there, Jack. But I think especially with kind of the concern over Malik Nabers' knee injury and him potentially starting the season on PUP again, hoping we get some more clarity on that as training camp approaches. But I do think this is likely going to be a rush first offense. Gretch, do you see things any differently here?
No, seems like that's what Harbaugh wants to do. He's put together a great staff. Huge fan of Matt Nagy and Greg Roman. This is super exciting in 2026 NFL. It does make me feel better about what we have in so many of the other offenses. And part of the reason that some of these shows have gone so long is, we're talking about these new coordinators and the fun ones in this division. This is the 20 years ago NFL, but they do have a better defense, or an expected better defense. They have done some work on the offensive line. They took a guard 10th overall. The expectations aren't like super high, but Thorne had him a little higher than some of the other people. They have Andrew Thomas as the key at left tackle, right? He could be a star, but the health is always a thing with him. I didn't go like crazy on the low PROE relative to the expected pass rate because they have obviously a lower win total, and so their expected pass rate's a little bit higher, and that's why I came in a little higher than you guys here. But like hearing you guys talk about it, I'm like, I'm probably too high. I just want them to be even lower as a run team. I mean, I do think they're going to try to play that style, the defense and run style that you guys were talking about.
All right, let's go to Jaxson Dart fantasy outlook in terms of inputs there. We're at 496 pass attempts, Gretch at 513. Pretty even on the completion percentage and yards per attempt. We're both at like 7.25 roughly on Dart. We do have Jaxson rushing a little bit more than Gretch does. We have 108 rush attempts for 468 yards. Gretch has 98 attempts for 512 yards. So quite a bit higher on the efficiency. We are a little bit higher on rushing touchdowns for Dart as well at 5.5. Gretch at 5.1. And that's what really stuck out to me on Dart's profile last year is he ended up with 9 rushing touchdowns in just 12 starts for him. So, pretty monster output there for Dart on the ground. Had 7 rush touchdowns in his first 7 games as a starter, and then only 2 in the final 5. He also dealt with, some concussion and injury issues. But Harbaugh in kind of the offseason comments, and we alluded to this with Jayden Daniels, like Jaxson Dart's going to play the way he plays. He was a little bit reckless and throwing around his body sometimes, like lowering his shoulder and head trying to get the extra yards. Maybe he can, kind of learn to slide or avoid contact a little bit better, but I do think the rushing output is going to consistently be strong for Jaxson Dart throughout this season and his career if he wants to, remain a positive, EPA per play quarterback in the NFL for his career. So, Jack, what are your thoughts on Dart entering his sophomore season?
Yeah, the rushing stuff is interesting considering the injuries he dealt with last year. He averaged 8.5 rushing fantasy points per game last year. That's via John Daigle. That is an incredible number, 7 carries inside the 5. He had a 10% seasonal designed run rate, but he had at least a 15% design run rate in 4 of his first 7 starts, and then it kind of slowed down after the injuries. I think that the injuries and kind of preserving his health should be a top priority for the Giants, just given that they want him to be their franchise quarterback. But with that being said, it's such a big part of his game. And John Harbaugh has said, we can run RPOs, we can run quarterback-driven runs. So it sounds like they plan to keep the designed runs in his game, which is big for his fantasy value. He had a 9.2% scramble rate last year, which is really, really high. So I think a lot of his actual value comes down to how much he keeps running. It sounds like, I agree with you that it's kind of a big part of his game. It's going to be tough for them to phase it out, and it sounds like they don't really plan to phase it out. And yeah, I still have questions about him as an actual passer. 6.7 yards per attempt. He took a sack on 9.4% of his dropbacks. His receiving core is a big question, I think, with Nabers potentially on the mend going into the season. They don't have a whole lot behind him. They lost Wan'Dale Robinson, obviously, this offseason as well. So a lot of his value just comes down to how much he can provide as a runner.
Yeah, and he had 34 designed rush attempts in those 12 games last year. We're only projecting 31 design carries. That does not include sneaks or scrambles there for Dart. So that was almost a spot where I thought we could come up, kind of looking at this. But again, we are projecting more rush attempts than Gretch. So Gretch, I'm curious your thoughts on the rushing input specifically here for Dart.
That's where I took it from.
Okay.
I don't have the exact number of design runs. I do it. I think I mentioned this. I do it as like a ratio of dropbacks, just because everything in my quarterback stuff is based on the per dropback rate. Even though that doesn't make a lot of sense because it's a designed run relative to dropbacks or different things. But I did make a note that I reduced his design run rate specifically because his health is such a hot topic and how they want to run the offense and those things. I thought he played really well at times. He came in with really good metrics on deep passing. That was the big note on him in last year's class, was that he had the best deep passing efficiency. Some people thought that was more gimmicky coming out of the Lane Kiffin offense. I thought he showed that at times last year. He threw some great balls. I was reading some of my stealing signals write-ups from in-season, and I had some notes in there that he wasn't always picked up by the receivers, like particularly Darius Slayton, who, as we get to receivers, I see you guys have projected as the number 2, and that's part of the reason why I pushed him down a little more is, I think they like Darius Slayton, and he gets open, and he draws volume, and he's been efficient, but man, he had some drops issues last year. He had a big offensive pass interference that cost him a potential long touchdown that would have helped Jaxson Dart's efficiency as well. I mean, you can argue that he only got the long touchdown because of the offensive pass interference. I believe a lot of people thought it wasn't a penalty. Anyway, I was reading back through some of that stuff and remembering that Dart did throw some good deep balls that didn't show up in the actual official stats. I think he's a good young quarterback. And young's an operative word because he was a very young rookie last year going into year 2 here. But for all the reasons you guys said, I mean, Jack just mentioned there's not the same depth at receiver behind Nabers. And then you also have the Nabers injury, but with no Wan'Dale Robinson and those things. And they signed a bunch of random free agents that are washed, Juju and Odell Beckham and all these dudes. So yeah, I'm not finding myself wanting to get in on a quarterback that I do think probably has legitimate injury concerns, because even though it seems obvious that he should protect himself better, I mean, him and Cam Scatterbo are apparently best buds, and they headbutt on the sideline. So I don't know how he's going to stop himself from concussions when he's giving them to himself before he even gets onto the field. And again, I do think he's a good passer, but I don't think the situation's great for huge upside there. So I wind up thinking he's not really worth the risk this year, and the profile's not that elite. It's not that great of an offense. They're going to be slow, and there are a lot of other quarterbacks that I do really like, but I don't dislike Jaxson Dart, the quarterback.
For sure, yeah. And he was QB7 in his 12 starts last year at 20.5 points per game. But again, so much of that came from the rushing department, and I think he kind of exceeded expectations in terms of the rushing touchdown production there. Again, he had 9 in those 12 games last year. We were projecting him for 5.5. Gretch is at like 5 for full season. So I think it's fair to expect that to get dialed back a bit there for Jaxson Dart. And we've been mostly in line, with ADP. We have him at QB 12. He's going as the QB 13 right now. So I think certainly fine, but in best ball, it is kind of hard to find some stacking partners to get super excited about. But before we hit the wide receiver room here, let's go to the running back rooms. Cam Scatterboo, we have for 194 carries. Gretch is at 214. We're at 45.5 targets. Gretch is at 49 there. And Tyron Tracy, we're at 133 rush attempts. Gretch at 111. We're at 31 targets on Tracy. Gretch is at 36 there. So we're 20 carries behind on Scatterboo and 22 carries ahead on Tyron Tracy. Like when I was prepping for this and just throughout the offseason, is like, man, if Scatterboo didn't have such a major injury, suffered a dislocated ankle and fractured fibula in week 8, I would be very, very willing to kind of glom on more volume to him. And maybe that's the wrong way to approach this, is to be too concerned about his injury. All reports are that the recovery has gone great. We've seen him in public appearances, like doing backflips, and while he may not be
and not landing them,
yeah,
like
not
what are we
them.
doing?
He may not be the smartest coconut in the bunch, but certainly he's going to get the ball, I think. And he quickly overtook Tyron Tracy last year as a rookie. It was like by week 3, he had the commanding RB1 role here, and he was really good as a receiving back, which I think has been a little bit underrated. He was at 6.5 yards per target last season, 27% target per out run, and 1.75 yards per out run according to our SIS numbers. So very strong output there. And then we don't expect him to be very efficient. We're both projecting 4.2 yards per carry, but do expect him to have the goal line role in this running back room. And then he has, the pass catching chops as well that he displayed his rookie season. So the high value touches are there. So this is a spot I like kind of want to bump Scatterboo, but the injury concerns coming off the major injury are there for sure. But Jack, what's your read on this Giants backfield?
Yeah, the pass catching stands out to me as well. You mentioned 1.7 yards per out run, 27% targets per out run. That's really, really good for a running back. I think that assuming health, he should have that role once again. The rushing was fine. He got the volume, and he had a 53% design carry share or better in the 4 games going into his injury. He outcarried Tracy 35-13 in the 2 games leading up to his injury. Tracy missed the previous 2 games with an injury, but he was clearly ahead of Tracy before the injury. He only averaged 4.1 yards per carry. Tracy was actually at 4.2, and Scatterboo was only slightly above average in yards after contact per attempt, according to PFF. I think given his play style, you would the kind of what we talked about earlier, where these guys who seek contact but don't have the long speed maybe don't perform as well in yards after contact per attempt as we'd expect. But he should have the goal line role. He should have the pass catching role. So the high value touches should be there. But coming off the injury, I think there's real concern about that. We've seen guys, Tony Pollard comes to mind with the fibula and tibia stuff, kind of struggling in the year after that. He does seem to be at 100%, or at least he says he is. Harbaugh called him a top-tier back, so I think that he's going to get the work. I think that the rushing efficiency is a little bit in question for me. If Scatterboo goes down, I think we'd see a similar split to what we saw last year. They still have Devin Singletary, and it was 141-93 Tracy over Singletary post-Scatterboo injury, so it's not like Tracy was a complete workhorse. Tracy did get the targets. So I don't think that Tracy's like massively interesting as a handcuff, but I do think that there is some, I have a little bit of concern about Scatterboo, and we've been a little bit below ADP all off season.
And it is mostly a volume play and in the middle of the 4th round for someone like Scatterboo. So yeah, Gretch, what's your read here?
That's the way I see it, but it is a 3-down high value touch profile, or at least last year he was a high value touch stud in a limited sample. I don't think you really need rushing yardage efficiency as much as you need the receiving stuff and you need the touchdowns, and that's what matters so much. He was at 4.1 yards per carry. I can get there as long as he's getting enough of the goal line work and the receiving work, which he was. And to Jack's point and your guys' point, the receiving efficiency was really strong. I don't know if either of you mentioned, but 8.6 yards after the catch per reception as well, really strong. But yeah, good yards per out run, good yards per target per out. His targets per out were at 22.4% by PFF's numbers. Tracy and Singletary both around 16%. Clear intent to get him the ball in the passing game as well, in my opinion there. So a lot of stuff there in the rookie season that, it's a different coaching staff, but was positive. Jack mentioned the rush shares. He had 3 games over 70% of the running back rushes before getting injured. Tracy later had 1 game over 7%, several over 60%. I had those notes because I was like, I don't know how to split this, because once Scatterboo was out, Tracy was getting a lot of work and was doing well. But before Scatterboo was out, he was dominating Tracy. And so I wound up a little bit higher on Scatterboo over Tracy than you guys as you were reading through those rush attempts. I don't think that I have it right or whatever. Like I don't know that I'll necessarily change it, but I think yours could totally be way more directionally accurate. It's a tough split because of how Scatterboo quickly took over so much of the work and then got hurt right away. And it's, where are we at with his health as well? I do want to note Scat's peripherals were a bit better than Tracy's, but Tracy's breakaway rate was again solid, and that's what drove his yards per carry being better. So Scatterboo had better evasion. He tested that way. He tested with really good agility and jumps and stuff, but bad straight line speed. This is a guy who's actually somewhat athletic at making guys miss in space, but to Jack's point, he's not going to actually turn it into a huge play. So it becomes the volume play as you guys are talking about. But I do like that he can play 3 downs and he gets a lot of the receiving stuff and he's a willing blocker and they love him at the goal line. It's a really good fantasy profile when he's healthy, and he was on his way to a huge win, a big hit for a rookie running back last year. A lot of people talked about how the rookie running backs didn't hit last year. This is the one that was going to be the breakout rookie running back star if he just stays healthy. The role was there with the high value touches and everything. Also want to throw in, they gave Patrick Ricard a nice deal. I think he's going to be involved, $3.5 million fully guaranteed for a 32-year-old fullback. John Harbaugh loves his guys, brings in, they're going to do they bring in, obviously, Isaiah Likely too. They're going to do the multi-tight end stuff some. They're going to run the ball a ton, as we've been talking about. I think they want that identity. And so even though Tracy had the better yards per carry, as I noted, he's not necessarily breaking his main tackles or evading tackles. Scatterboo's sort of this identity back, as a term I've used in the past. That you mentioned even the Dart quote where he's like, we're going to give the ball to Scatterboo a bunch. He's not we're going to give it to the running backs. He's like, I have a running back I want to give it to that sets the tone. So I do think that's going to, all that stuff works in Scatterboo's favor. It's kind of hard not to. For as much as we joke about him not being the whatever you said, the brightest coconut in the bunch, he is the one that will ram his head into people, and they like that. I mean, football teams like that. It energizes people. It gets the people fired up.
No doubt. I think I want to move some base work off Tracy to Scatterboo. The further we talk through this, and that was my inkling coming into this show as well. And we've been a little bit above market on Tracy and behind on Scatterboo. And Jack's point on not necessarily loving Tracy as a super high upside handcuff play. It was a different coaching staff last year, but in terms of carries inside the 5-yard line, Devin Singletary had 9 and Tyron Tracy only had 1 last season. That was the spot consistently where they would take Tracy out and put Devin Singletary in around the goal line. So, you don't love that, especially when you're looking for upside as a handcuff that he might not even have the goal line role if Scatterboo were to go down again. So I think it's kind of a thin profile for Tracy to really have much meaningful fantasy upside this year, despite, he's been solid in his first 2 seasons. I don't want to discount that too much. He has been a solid NFL running back. So, he has 175 carries and 35 receptions in his first 2 seasons. That's nothing to sneeze at, but I do think the base case for Scatterboo here is quite a bit stronger. Okay, let's go to the wide receiver room, headlined by Malik. Nabers suffered a torn ACL and meniscus in week 4 of last season. So it will be nearly 11 months to week 1 of the 2026 season, but he did have an offseason surgery to clean up that knee and relieve some stiffness. And then again, the reporting back in, I guess it was April leading up to the draft, all the offseason injury reporting is almost effusively positive on all of these players. And even at that point of the offseason, people were saying, the neighbor stuff hasn't gone as smoothly as we would like it to. And then you have the surgery followed up, and now kind of the rumblings are he could potentially start on PUP. He might not even be ready to practice day 1 of training camp. So certainly a lot of concern over that. We've kind of continued to tick down Nabers throughout the offseason, have been well below market on him. We've had him as a 4th round pick the whole time. And he was going in the 2nd round to start best ball drafts. He has now dipped to, ADP of 38 on Underdog. We're still behind there at 44th overall. But in terms of inputs on Nabers, we're at 113 targets. Gretch is at 128. On Darius Slayton, we're at 48. Gretch is at 26. So again, pretty decent gap on that spot. On Darnell Mooney, we're at 38 targets. Gretch is at 49. And then on Malachi Fields, we're at 38 targets. Gretch is at 44. So I think those are probably the top four to talk about here. Gretch did mention, they did sign OBJ and Juju Smith-Schuster to contracts, but there are no guarantees in those. They also signed Calvin Austin this offseason, but he only has $450K guaranteed. So I think it's mostly, Nabers wide receiver one whenever he's healthy, then Slayton and Mooney and Malachi Fields kind of fighting those three for the other two, wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 spots here. So Jack, take it away on this Giants wide receiver room on who you'd like to hit on first.
Yeah, so with Nabers, it's purely just a question of health. There's no questioning the talent. 32% target per out run as a rookie, 27% last year in limited playing time, obviously, and now he doesn't have to compete for targets with Wan'Dale Robinson. So I think if Nabers was fully healthy, he'd be a clear first-round pick. The question is just health. Nabers himself said after the season that he's going to prioritize getting back to 100% over getting onto the field as soon as possible. It doesn't sound like the injury recovery has gone as smoothly as he or the Giants have hoped until the last week or so. All of the reporting about his injury had almost been like comically negative to the point where I was thinking he would very likely start on PUP and maybe more likely to miss week 5 than play week 1. Although Hayden Winks tweeted out right before we started this podcast, so I haven't had a chance to listen to the clip yet, that Nabers might be on, the latest report is that Nabers might be on the Andrew Thomas return timeline, which would be week 3, and that he's probably closer to a week 1 return than starting on PUP. That was very recent within the last few hours, so I haven't had a chance to actually listen to the clip yet. But I think a lot of the Nabers questions are yet to be answered, and we'll kind of figure out exactly where he should go throughout training camp. We have been lower on him all offseason because the injury reporting has been so negative. And I don't mind that stance, although it's one that we're going to have to change quickly if it seems like he has a real chance to play week 1. There's also a difference between when is he going to get on the field and when is he actually going to be Malik Nabers again. I know he said that he wants to get back to 100% before he actually plays, which is good, but it sounds like this injury recovery just has not gone very well. So I do think that there's probably a difference between the first week he's active and the first week he's back to the 30% target share player we're used to seeing. Beyond him, it's definitely not great. Slayton is still on a solid contract, but he only had a 15% target per out run last year. He was efficient, 8.5 yards per target, and he did have a 21% target share over the Giants' last 4 games and 4 games over a 20% target share in total. He also had a hamstring last year that he got hurt in week 6 and re-aggravated it a few weeks later. Mooney had a really rough year last year, although he also had some, injury excuses. He broke his collarbone on the first day of training camp last year, but it was just really rough for him. 17% target per out run, 6.2 yards per target, 1.02 yards per out run. Drake London missed some time, and Mooney did not have over a 15.6% single game target share in any of the games without Drake London. He had some drop issues as well. He got a 1-year deal worth up to $10 million, but only a $3 million base. So I think that the door is open for Malachi Fields to potentially see some work here. Whether he can actually do that is another thing altogether. He's on the slower side, 4'6", 140, but he does have good size at 6'4", 218. Dane Brugler comped him to Michael Pittman. He had a decent 3-cone time despite being slow in the 40. And Brugler also said he's a solid blocker. So we'll kind of see where the Malachi Field stuff goes. We have Slayton as the wide receiver 2 here because he did have some solid target share games last year without Nabers, and he still is on the contract. He has some familiarity with the team, although obviously it's a whole new staff. But yeah, I'm not super excited about any of the guys besides a potentially healthy Nabers. I think that we'll get to this in a moment, but I think that they're going to have a lot of tight end involvement here, which potentially mutes the wide receivers, even if Nabers is out.
Yeah, I think that was a good breakdown of a lot of the guys that don't really matter. I don't want anything to do with Darnell Mooney or any of them. I have Mooney for the second most targets because they brought him in and gave him $3 million, the new regime, and Slayton was kind of the incumbent. Although I have Slayton for it looks like about 0.5 better yards per target, just looking at our sheet here, because Slayton has been the more efficient player, and Jack just talked through some of the issues with Mooney in Atlanta, sub 1 yards per out run in 2 of the past 3 years. They brought in like Calvin Austin here in some volume in Pittsburgh, but was inefficient. Slayton's a deep. My issue with Slayton is like he's a deep threat, but without much volume. He doesn't earn enough volume. He's and Jack just said this. His yards per out run's bad despite being efficient. You know, the yards per target is solid, and that's what I was kind of alluding to. I have his yards per target projected okay, but you think that's a fit for Jaxson Dart's skill set too, and it might be, and he might have some big plays if he gets 50 targets, like you guys say, but he tends to not earn a really high rate of targets per route. You have Juju, you have OBJ. They added 5 free agent wide receivers. I mean, it's just the land of misfits here. As far as Malachi Fields, I ended up getting pretty excited about him as I went through the projection. He's a tall, big receiver, great vert, slower 40 time, as Jack said. I didn't see that shuttle note, though, but that's exciting, too, that he was efficient was agile in that way. Harbaugh claimed that he's consistently running over 21 miles per hour in games, which is like really fast. I don't understand how that tracks because he ran the slower 40 time, and like when we were talking about like the Keaton Mitchell stuff, like he hit 20 plus miles per hour like 7 times. Like if Malachi Fields is actually running 21 miles per hour in games, that's a pretty interesting note. Jack's smiling over here. He's like, I don't believe John Harbaugh at all. But the production was reasonable. He had a higher ADOT. He earned good volume for his higher ADOT, and his yards per targets were solid. So he's a guy that I think is like vaguely interesting because of all of the other profiles in this passing game being guys that I don't really want anything to do with.
Yeah, just to speak on Fields, the profile as well. You know, at ETR we do the offseason prospect pods with Mike Renner and Silva and Levitan are on those, and Silva and Renner are both big Notre Dame guys where Fields went. And he was, you know, a predominant X receiver there, but I think both of them were pretty optimistic that his role could switch a little bit in the NFL to not just be stuck out wide, and he does have, you know, potential like big slot capabilities. But so that's something to keep in mind, that, you know, he does profile as like a primary X receiver, was close to 90% out wide at Notre Dame, but I do think there is some potential for him to kind of change that profile in the NFL, just based on what the Notre Dame stands have said.
Nice. Yeah, that's good to hear. As far as Nabers, though, like obviously, as Jack said, it's all health. It's all the number one stuff. I will say, like back-to-back 2+ yards per out run seasons to start a career is good, especially because his yards per target have not necessarily been as good as you would think with the skill set. Like he's one of these guys that does everything. He catches the ball short, he earns the volume deep, and he's a good winner of the ball deep. He had a really sweet catch in the end zone from like a Russell Wilson moon ball in that Dallas Cowboys game early last year, where like he had a breakout game and then he got hurt right after it, which was super fun because I had so much Malik Nabers. I think he was going to be an absolute star with Jaxson Dart last year. Obviously, the question now is, what do we have with the knee injury going forward? But what I will note is he got there with the 2+ yards per out run seasons, and the second one obviously being routes limited. He got there in 2 different ways. As a rookie, he had a subpar yards per target at an ADOT of 9.7, but at a 29.7% targets per route. It was a lot of short stuff. The quarterback play was really, really bad. He actually led the NFL in targets, if I'm not mistaken, in 2024 as a rookie. Then last year, his ADOT was 18.2. It was almost double the 9.7. That's my point. He could be a deep threat. He can be an underneath guy and ball in hand guy. That was mostly because all Russ can do is throw deep balls, which Russ has now admitted because he's going to be, I don't know, in a broadcast booth somewhere this year. He only had a 22.4% targets per route last year, way down from the 29.7 as a rookie, but his yards per target was almost 2 yards higher. Again, this is only 134 routes. I think it would have rounded out that profile, especially if he could have played with Dart a little bit. That's one of the like bigger frustrations I think last year. It's like we only got him with Russell Wilson. We didn't even get him with the young, interesting quarterback to see what would have happened there. The knee injury is a real concern, but again, I think he's a guy who earns volume at all different depths. I just want to, Jack, you said that Hayden just tweeted something out. I was trying to look at it. He's tweeted a bunch of stuff. What was the note? Like, I just want to know that. To just repeat it. Is it finally optimistic? Because I remember like Davis Maddock tweeting out the gate like a little while ago, and I was like, dude, this guy's rehabbing a knee injury. Leave him alone. Like he's not. Yeah, he doesn't look great, but I think he's potentially fine. But we got a positive note.
Yeah, the update was that, well, positive relative to my expectations at least. The note was that he's close to the Andrew Thomas return timeline last year, which was week 3, and closer to a week 1 return than starting on PUP, which would be pretty contrary to my expectations as of 4 hours ago, which was that he was almost a near lock to start on PUP.
Nice. Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, I don't really know what to do with him from a projection standpoint. What I would just reiterate is I think he's in the absolute upper echelon at wide receiver when healthy or pre-injury. You never know how efficient guys are going to be when they come back from this type of injury. I, honest to God, thought he was in the tier with like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase at the time of his injury last year when we saw those deep plays and we saw the catch and run as a rookie. Everything that he has in the bag. It's a bummer that he got hurt. We don't really know what to expect. The price is so cheap that it definitely tantalizes me. I mean, it definitely makes me think if this guy's healthy somehow, he's going to be an absolute smash at his ADP. But at the same time, he's not healthy.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's gotten to the point he's now in like the early part of the fourth round, which I think is fair to take stabs on him, especially in contests with such back weighted production and like payouts as in best ball when everything comes in week 17. Like theoretically, Malik Nabers could be close to 100% there and really, posting some monster scores if the target numbers return.
Yeah, one other thing I want to note, they definitely have deep threats. So like one of the things I was talking about with different profiles, I would like Nabers ADOT to be a little lower, like that rookie year where he had like a 30% target spread and they're getting him the ball in his hands a lot. That's like what Jamar Chase has been, and Puka Nacua has a lower ADOT, not super low, but they're lower enough that you're getting a lot of target volume, which we want volume. You don't want him to be at an 18 ADOT. Like I had that concern with Alec Pierce. They have a bunch of deep threats. Darnell Mooney is a deep receiver. Darius Slayton's a deep receiver. Malachi Fields had high ADOTs. The rookie, OBJ has at times been able to get vertical and been used as a vertical receiver. So a lot of the guys behind Nabers, I mean, there's a lot of targets available somewhere in this offense, but it could create an opportunity for Nabers if he's not. Yeah, if he's more of an underneath receiver, it might actually. I don't know if that's going to be better for his knee or not. I have no idea. I'm not a doctor, but I'm telling myself that's the case because I want to believe.
All right, let's go to the tight end room. Again, they do sign Isaiah Likely to a big 3-year, $40 million contract, $26 million guaranteed there for Likely, who is 26 years old, comes over with 194 career targets, obviously played under John Harbaugh there in Baltimore, so some familiarity with this scheme and coaching staff. Theo Johnson also returns here, and it was funny. I was looking, Theo Johnson had a decent cumulative stat line last year: 45 catches, 528 yards, and 5 touchdowns. That would have been the best season of Isaiah Likely's career, which I just found interesting. Likely had never posted that many catches, yards, or he had surpassed those touchdowns once. But this is a pretty valuable tight end role, I think, in this offense, and will continue to be. And Jack alluded to, we have a decent amount of targets going to this tight end room as a whole. So on Likely, we're at 65 targets. Gretch is at 62. We're at 33.5 on Theo Johnson. Gretch is at 46. So, we're expecting Likely to come in and be the clear tight end one, but I don't want to just, fully knock aside Theo Johnson because I do think there is some promise and upside to his profile as well. But Jack, take us through your thoughts on this tight end room.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that we're actually low versus market on Isaiah Likely, and we come in higher than Gretch, and seeing that, I don't really mind our current stance. But the buzz on Likely all offseason has been really positive. He obviously follows Harbaugh, so there's familiarity there, and Harbaugh clearly wanted him as one of the weapons in this pass game. Dan Duggan said he's going to be featured in this pass game. Harbaugh said he's certain that Likely is going to be putting up the stats that presumably the reporters asking him about Likely were asking about. It wasn't a great season for Likely last year. 16% target per out run, down from 22% in 2024. And in the one stretch we've seen of Likely without Andrews, he only had a 15% average single game target share without Andrews in 2023. Those are fine target numbers, but it's nothing crazy. And you mentioned Theo Johnson. His targets per out run jumped from 13% in 2024 to 18% last year. He led the Giants without Nabers, excluding Wan'Dale Robinson, with a 16% target share and 20% targets per out run. Those are both pretty good numbers, and he was respectably efficient given the state of the offense as well. We're projecting Likely well ahead, just given the familiarity with Harbaugh, the decision to sign him to a pretty sizable contract immediately after getting hired. So we're expecting Likely as the clear tight end one. But like I said, we're still below. We're 8 spots below his underdog ADP, which I feel pretty good about after seeing Gretch's projection.
Yeah, I think Likely is good and deserves a bigger routes role than he's ever gotten in Baltimore. I guess I don't buy that it's going to happen under the coach that always used him that way, like in a limited way. Like the fact that Harbaugh brought him over, people saw that as a really big positive. I was like, yeah, I mean, Harbaugh wants to bring some of his guys over that know his system, that know his culture and all of these things, but he's part of the limitation that's always been there for Isaiah Likely. Why is this the guy that you think is going to unlock something, whatever they think he can't do? Harbaugh might be part of the reason they think that he can't do that, right? And then as far as Theo Johnson, you were talking about it, like he was actually really good last year. I got the impression that Jaxson Dart and him had like a pretty good connection. As a rookie, Theo Johnson, 11.7% targets per out run. I was out on him last year, probably on the show and in my research last year. He jumped that from 11.7 to 16.9% in year two. That's not great. It's way more in the realm of playable at tight end. Still only a 1.24 yards per out run, but you're seeing this like ascension and it's growing. And we do know that teams want to run multi-tight end stuff. They also have Chris Manhertz as that, blocking tight end, that number 3 guy. I think Likely's really good. Again, I think he's a great receiver. He had a really good prospect profile in that regard too. Great catch rates every year, great depth adjusted racer, that efficiency stat I like to use in my projections. But I don't know why Johnson would just go away. And I do think there are going to be running back targets here. There are a lot of wide receivers running around. I have the tight end share rising, but not massively. Maybe like as I'm listening to it, like maybe I should push the tight end share higher. I've had a really hard time with Likely's price the whole season too. As I heard Jack talk through that, it's like, that's the way I've been on it. I don't really know why this idea that he's like ready to take off and have this new role and everything is so clear. There's even a quote in the offseason where they're asking Harbaugh about Likely, and he's saying all the positive things. Then he says, and don't forget Theo Johnson. We like both these guys a lot. And it's like, yeah, you have the familiarity with Likely. Theo Johnson's the guy that's on the new roster you took over. But obviously when Harbaugh took over this team, he did his research on the players, and he seems to think Theo Johnson's a good player as well. So I don't get it. I have Theo Johnson well ahead of you guys in targets. I know the market's completely out on him. I think he like, if you're in a super deep tight end premium league or something, is probably going to have a real role. There's targets to go around, as we talked about. But he would be vaguely interesting because he was efficient and seemed to have a little bit of a connection with Dart, who ultimately, is going to be the one pulling the trigger on these throws. But yeah, I have Likely for 62 targets, Theo for 46. Maybe that's not a big enough gap. But I don't see where Likely is like a 100 target guy, because that would mean Theo's basically doing nothing, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
I do think it's fair to expect both to play a reasonable amount. Kind of mentioned that at the team macro level. I think this team will probably be in more 12 personnel than 11 personnel, honestly, by the end of the season. You mentioned Patrick Ricard, signed to a deal. Like they're gonna run some 21, and 22 personnel here, I think as well. And so I was a little bit surprised, honestly, by like Likely's profile looking back. I kind of thought, oh man, it's just a route limitation, and like he's been really strong per route, but like that honestly wasn't necessarily the case over the last 3 years. Like his 2024 was legitimately good at 22% target per out run and 1.95 yards per out run according to our SIS data, but much lower at 16%, 15% target per out run in the surrounding years. And so, I agree with you guys. Came out a little bit more skeptical of the likely upside in this offense. Is he's just topped out at 309 routes in his career. Meanwhile, Theo Johnson ran 405 last year, according to our SIS data. So, it's, I think it ultimately comes down to, man, can he really consolidate the routes? And it sounds like none of us are super confident that will happen for Isaiah Likely.
Yeah, the big part of it too is like, we're talking about how efficient he is, and if we're wrong, my guess would be it's because they just think Likely's a way better tight end, and he is way more efficient and all that. But with that extreme efficiency that he's had, it sort of emphasizes that some of the production has been almost maxed out in these limited routes rules. Like we've seen a fantasy viable role in Baltimore, but like we know that Lamar Jackson at times has had really strong per attempt efficiency, and so like Likely spiked the TD rates and some of these things that aren't likely to happen in this offense either. He really does need to add the routes. To your point, the targets per route have bounced around and sometimes been low. They haven't been great. Mm-hmm. It's all about, for him, it's all about the yards per target. It's all about the depth adjusted racer I was talking about. The ball in hand stuff is good. He is good. And the catch rates, I said, anything after the target, he's good as a playmaker. But you're in a tough offense. You're not going to have the Lamar Jackson pass TD rate. You really do need to add a ton of routes to justify this cost. And I don't know. It's not the way that we see it, either of us.
All right, that will wrap up the final episode of this divisional projections series. We teased maybe going 3 hours at the top of the show, and sure enough, we surpassed that mark. So shout out to anyone still listening with us here on we surpassed 20 hours of content, 3 hours on this episode, but wouldn't want to close it out any other way.
I mean, I figured I needed to go really long. I mean, what are you guys gonna do? Fire me? I don't even work for ETR. Like this is a blast to do this with you guys.
This is what you get to. We've had some like night recordings, and this is a morning recording for us. I know me and Gretch are nice and caffeinated, so I think a little bit longer winded here today. But sincerely appreciate again just everyone tuning in with us, and the feedback we've gotten on the show has been really awesome. So once again, just super grateful to be in the spot and role for this series. So shout out to all the listeners. You guys make it valuable for us, and are the reason why we do this. So appreciate all you guys tuning in with us. If you want to follow Jack and Gretch on Twitter, they're at JackMiller02 and at Yards Per Gretch. I'm on there at Mark Dank. But once again, huge thank you to tuning in with us throughout this series and for all the great feedback. But that will do it for this ETE 2026 projection series. Have a great day, everyone, and peace out.